a great experience. You ought to write a book, And so he was definitely the glass half full guy. Mm-hmm. And then I do read, like in '89, I started jotting down some things, and I was just lucky that it all came rushing back to me when I sat down. It was really a pure, everything I've written subsequently has had some like little tinge of the money grab, like I can make money writing.
Sure.
But that first one, because people thought absolutely nobody's going to read a wrestling book.
Did they tell you that?
Yeah, over and over again. And I guess we proved them wrong.
Yeah. It seems like every big wrestler who comes through at this point, especially WWE, writes a book. It's almost part of the formula. Like, did you have any experience writing before?
Well, I was a pretty good writer. I look back in my old college papers, and one of my professors was like, you really ought to pursue writing for a career.
And you're like, no, I want to get hit with barbed wire.
Exactly. I'd begun my training in wrestling, and I thought, that's a ridiculous idea. I had no idea that in some ways I was just building content.
What do we want to talk about?
I am him. I am him.
Hey, this is the Red Carpet Reign featuring TBK, the Turnbuckle King himself. We'll talk about a brand new audiobook to the Red Carpet Reign channel. It's a legendary book. As you heard, you had the legendary Mick Foley talk about celebrating the 20-year anniversary of Mick Foley. His book, Have a Nice Day, which is a tale of blood, sweat, and sweat socks. So he had very legendary book. And also Mick Foley, he revolutionized the game in WWE. When he made Have a Nice Day, a tale of blood and sweat socks, he was the first ever in the wrestling industry to write an autobiography. Not only did he write an autobiography, he wrote the whole book himself. And he was led on to a blueprint that many others will follow. Look at what we have today. We had Stone Cold write a book, Brock Lesnar, Daniel Bryan, Jim Ross, Becky Lynch now, Ronda Rousey. Previous books of the last two, Becky and Ronda, are also on his channel. Check it out. Now, since he started this blueprint, Mick Foley, also what's unique about him, he is not from any famous wrestling family. He's also not connected to anybody some sort of way. He put in the hard work. He earned his name. Had a very, very reputable reputation in the wrestling industry that he do to this day, even though he wrestled in other organizations, WCW and TNA. And he was not a WWE original, but he did come to WWE, earn his name, have legendary moments in WWE, and he decided to highlight them on this audiobook. This book, Have a Nice Day, A Tale of Blood and Sweat Socks. It's his career. He'll talk about, many matches in his career, maybe time in New Japan. Of course, his famous 1998 Hell in a Cell match versus The Undertaker, which he fell off a 15-roof ladder. He fell off twice. Many of us as fans thought that he may not wake up, but he did. Thank God he did. So this book was published in 2000. So he talked about the 20-year anniversary, but that was 6 years ago. We're 24 years later. And it's Have a Nice Day, Tale, Blood, and Sweat Socks. And it's literally just that. So this is a very, very good book. Now, I've heard bits and pieces of the book, but never heard the whole book, myself. So I'll be right there along with you guys. Now, however, there will be two parts to this book. We're going to have a part one, And then there will be a part 2. So part 1 is right here, as you saw in the thumbnail. Part 2 is right here where we at now. So before we begin, let's give out shout outs. Miss Gilbert, reaction, salute to you. Thanks for coming out. Let's come to Red Carpet Ring. Thank you. Appreciate that. Uncle Jackie, Sports and Variety Network. Salute to you. Appreciate your support as well. And then we got Zone 864 TV. Salute to you, bro. We are going to continue on this audiobook. It's not going to be long like the Becky Lynch audiobook or Rhonda. It's altogether maybe 4 hours. But with that being said, we're going to get into that, dive into this audiobook, and see what Mick Foley had to say about his career, his life, etc., etc. So I'm not going to hold you guys too much longer. You guys are here for Mick Foley. You guys want to hear about his autobiography, his career. We're going to do just that. So let's do that. Let's talk about Mick Foley. Have a nice day. A Tale of Blood and Sweat Socks. Let's do that.
Harper Audio presents Have a Nice Day, written and read by hardcore legend and #1 New York Times best-selling author Mick Foley. Let's take part in this daring audio journey. I was 18 in the fall of 1983. Upon graduation from Ward Melville High School in East Setauket, New York that June, I had spent the summer lifeguarding at the Stony Brook Racket Club and daydreaming about professional wrestling. Up on the stand for continuous 8-hour shifts, I had plenty of time to envision suplexes and dives off the top rope like my idol Jimmy Superfly Snuka while I watched over the well-being of a bunch of spoiled rich kids. My brother John, on the other hand, was in his 3rd year as a prestigious town of Brookhaven lifeguard, which meant that unlike me, he guarded at an actual beach that actual good-looking women frequented. In addition, he was given an hour off for every hour worked, during which, rumor had it, the town guards would pump up with a pair of dumbbells before taking the stand. But hey, my job had its benefits too, such as free tennis privileges at the club, which I used liberally, until my racket-throwing, yelling, and court-diving ways led to the termination of my court privileges. Looking back, I think I may have actually thrown the town lifeguarding test to avoid the indignity of wearing the official bikini bathing suit that the town guards were required to wear. Even at a lean, mean 200 pounds, Mrs. Foley's little boy was never cut out for Speedos. So as a result, I grudgingly accepted my responsibility to watch out for spoiled children. The sport of lacrosse had been my passion for several years. At my father's request, my father being Dr. Jack Foley, the Director of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation for the entire Three Village School District, I had also played football and basketball as a sophomore, but in honesty, I had sucked at both of them. I think I had 1 tackle and 1 basket for the entire season on each of those teams. It wasn't that I wasn't a good athlete, I just seemed to be an underachiever when it came to team sports. In football, I would actually bend down to tie my shoes when it came time to pick sides for practice. In basketball, I liked to stand outside and wait for long-range jumpers. I guess that's why I enjoyed playing goalie in lacrosse. Even though I was part of a team, the responsibility was all mine. I loved the challenge of stopping shots without a chest protector or cup. It was my propensity for playing without a cup that led to the much publicized testicle the size of a grapefruit story on Raw is War 14 years later. Actually, the whole story is slightly misleading, as I didn't make a habit of playing without a cup. I just oftentimes forgot to wear one. My ball wasn't exactly the size of a grapefruit either, more like a medium-sized tangerine. Lacrosse was so important to me that as a senior, I went out for the winter track team strictly to shape up for the spring season, during which I would grace the goal for the Ward Melville Patriots. The fact that I was no runner was soon discovered, and I began taking to bailing out on the far side of the track and hiding in the woods for a couple of laps. I threw the shot put and discus too, but one look at my shoulder development should tell you how I fared at that endeavor. One day before practice, I was talking to John McNulty, who was nicknamed McNugget in honor of the McDonald's food of questionable origin. "Track, huh, slick guy?" he said before adding, "You might be the slowest guy in the school." "I know," I agreed, "but I just want to get in shape for lacrosse." John thought it over before saying the words that would have a profound effect on my life. "Why don't you go out for wrestling?" he wondered. "Even if you never have a match, it will get you in better shape than track will." I went out for the team and had the time of my life. I loved it. I loved the competition and the pressure and the knowledge that whatever I did was done on my own. I really only had one problem with wrestling. I simply liked it so much that I'd lost my desire to play lacrosse. I'd been a big pro wrestling fan for a long time, but I never considered it as a career option. Now, however, with a little bit of amateur background behind me, I began to see the possibilities. I began studying tapes of my favorite wrestlers. I became obsessed with the sport and began to believe I could actually do it. In June 1983, I attended my first match at Madison Square Garden to see Jimmy Snuka battle Don Morocco in a bloody double disqualification. I was hooked. I didn't need lacrosse anymore. I had pro wrestling. The absence of lacrosse as a factor brought about a problem of its own. I had applied to colleges with the intention of playing goalie, and now that intention was gone. I really had no desire to go to the schools that had recruited me, Salisbury State in Maryland or Western Maryland in, well, Western Maryland. Instead, I settled on Cortland State University, which was located in between Syracuse and Binghamton in upstate New York. Upon enrollment, I immediately began a quest with my old buddy Scott Dara to be an amazingly average student, and in that quest, I was successful. I was on course to achieving straight C's across the board when I went home for fall break. Fall break presented a tricky scheduling problem. I was supposed to return to school on Sunday, October 16th, in order to be at classes on Monday. This would be in direct conflict to the highly anticipated rematch between Jimmy Superfly Snuka and Don Morocco, which was scheduled for October 17th. I considered my options. On one hand, I had sociology class with John Alt. On the other, I had my favorite wrestler and his bitter rival at the most famous arena in the world, inside a steel cage no less. I thought about John Alt, who had lost me the moment he said, "Let's talk about narcissism," or more simply, narcissistic self-proliferation. Then I thought about Snuka and his dive off the top of the cage a year ago in a matchup with Bob Backlund. It was no contest. Most of the card was forgettable, or maybe I was just exhausted, but when Howard Finkel announced an intermission, I saw the chain link fence come out. I felt my senses tingle. I actually was nervous. This was the culmination of the bloody Snuka Morocco wars, and I knew that at Madison Square Garden, inside a steel cage, they would let it all hang out. I later must have watched a video of that Snuka Morocco cage match a dozen times, and in truth, it was just an average match. A little on the short side as well, but the magic in the air was unmistakable. I wasn't the only one anticipating something special. Just as Snuka had things going his way, the thing was over. He sprang off the ropes and delivered a flying headbutt that sent Morocco through the ropes and out the door. "That's it?" I said out loud. "A 12-hour trip for that?" Sure, it had been a good match, but it wasn't what I had paid to see. Suddenly, I saw Snuka's unmistakable display of rage inside the ring. I felt my heart rate pick up a little as the Fly went after his prey outside the ring. A moment later, both men were back in the ring, and a Snuka suplex had the magnificent one lying prone in the middle. All it took was that one glance upward at the steel mesh that surrounded him, and the garden started to buzz. A loud buzz that grew with each upward step that Snuka made. After all these years, it's still the most impressive sight I've ever seen. The muscular Snuka standing barefoot on top of the cage, his face a mask of crimson while flashbulbs bathed him in light. In a moment, it was over, but the memory will live with me forever. It was a defining moment in my life. It was the day I knew without a doubt what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a wrestler, but even more, I wanted to make people feel the way I had just felt. In December 1983, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I just didn't know how to go about doing it. A snowy winter night shortly before Christmas break would serve as a strange catalyst for my professional wrestling career. I was in a bar called Tootie and Muldoon's on a Saturday night, courtesy of the fake ID I had purchased in New York City during my first Snuka Morocco encounter back in June. The bar had 2 levels, one that played rock and roll and one that played dance music. Somehow, against my better taste and judgment, I always ended up in the basement listening to It's Raining Men and trying to look cool, probably failing at it too. I was hanging with my buddies, John Hennessy and Steve McKiernan, who was now my roommate. Steve had started out as Scott Darrah's roommate, but Scott had never quite been happy at C-State and had let his grades fall to nearly unchartable levels. I was having fun at school, however, and this night was shaping up to be a good one. The World Wrestling Federation was on the television above the bar, and a rare title match was taking place. In the present-day wrestling scene, hot matches take place all the time on television. But back in '83, the World Wrestling Federation, like most wrestling shows, filmed a series of one-sided matchups. So it was with great excitement that I witnessed Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson, whose then 11-year-old son Dwayne would go on to become the most electrifying man in sports entertainment, defeat the Wild Samoans for the World Wrestling Federation Tag Team Championship. I would have been perfectly content to just bask in the glow of that glorious title change, but my night suddenly went from great to history-making when I saw Kathy walk down the stairs. Man, I liked Kathy. She was beautiful, she was funny, but more important, she made me feel great just to be around her. Her eyes would light up and she would literally beam when I talked to her. I could talk to her for hours, and I did so on that fateful evening. It also didn't matter that she was slightly intoxicated and that the intoxication made walking quite difficult for her. I was there for that too. The downtown area in Cortland was at the bottom of a hill that led to the campus. Kathy's dorm was directly at the top of the hill, and I accompanied her on the walk home while flurries of snow fell softly around us. Without warning, her cold little hand was in mine, and despite the winter chill, I started to sweat because, believe it or not, I'd never been quite that far before. When we got to her dorm, we talked for a few more minutes. I wasn't about to weasel my way into her room, as I was confident that there would be plenty of time for that type of thing in our future. "Can I kiss you goodnight, Kathy?" I politely asked the Irish beauty with the glowing smile. Man, she looked incredible even in a slightly drunken haze. She didn't answer me verbally, but instead responded by reaching up and pulling my head down to her softly. I was ecstatic to be the recipient of a genuinely tender kiss that included neither parted lips nor probing tongue, but consisted of just the right amount of lip-to-lip pressure. I didn't have a lot of experience to draw from, but it seemed to me like a perfect kiss. Up to that point, it was certainly the most romantic moment in my life, and even now rates up in the top 10. I looked into her eyes and they were smiling as I gently rubbed her chilled cheek with my thumb. "Good night, Kathy," I said softly. "I had a great time with you." She responded with the words that buried my heart but launched my career. "Good night, Frank." My whole life felt like a record needle being scratched across an album as I struggled to gain my bearings. Frank? There had to be an explanation. Maybe she was thinking of my middle name, Francis, and just figured she'd call me Frank for short. Yeah, that was logical. Yeah, my ass, it was logical. Reality had bit me, and it was holding on hard, and reality was that this girl I thought so highly of didn't know my name. My mind and heart were hurting bad as I bounded home, which was another half-mile away. Like Superfly, I too was going to fly tonight. Physical pain always somehow seemed to relieve mental pain for me, and I was in need of some relief. And how did I spell relief? Superfly. I had a ritual that was a big hit with a few friends. They would fill the room with clouds of baby powder, our version of dry ice, to the opening chords of Diary of a Working Man by Blackfoot. By the time the tempo picked up, I would be pumped for my move, and the dive off my bed would take place just as Ricky Rattlesnake Medlock hit the high-pitched scream in the song. I felt like this ritual would make me forget about the whole Kathy incident, even if just for a little while. I walked into the room and Steve McKiernan was already there. "How's it going, Mick?" he cheerily said. I simply told Steve to get the baby powder and the Blackfoot album ready because I was ready to take flight. After the dive, which knocked the wind out of me, hurt my ribs, and drew praise from a couple drunks who were hanging out in my friends Bill and Dingle's room, I was ready to talk. I decided to handle this problem the way I handled the all-important events in my life. Get the camera, Steve. Let's document this thing. I had been given a Canon AE-1 for Christmas a year earlier, and I had been wearing it out ever since. In much the same way I would react when my ear was torn off in Germany, I wanted visual proof of the important events of my life. We then proceeded to shoot a series of photos that documented my depression, attempted fictional suicide, and subsequent rescue by my friends. The pictures were an immediate hit among my tiny circle of friends. Photos were good, but this story needs to be put on film, I thought, and we began to put the legend of Frank Foley onto 8mm film. I guess I'm dating myself when I talk about 8mm film, but video cassette recorders were fairly new in 1983, and video cameras were practically non-existent. So we borrowed an 8mm projector, and in January 1984, decided to record the events of December 1983 for posterity. The ancient camera required a huge spotlight for lighting, and the glow attracted an overflow crowd to the doorway of room 317 in Fitzgerald Hall to see what was going on. They were treated to a cloud of baby powder, a high-pitched Ricky Medlock scream, and a now 220-pound weirdo in an old red flannel shirt diving off his bed onto a teddy bear. Unbeknownst to the spectators, I had put a mouthful of red food coloring into my mouth as I climbed up the bed, and upon impact, I spit the whole thing out. Again, my wind was knocked out, but even in my pain, I heard a female voice cry out, "Oh, that's the most disgusting thing I've ever seen." I vividly remember thinking, I've got to get some more of that response. Unfortunately, the filming was a flop as the ancient camera broke, and I was left with a room of splattered red to clean up, a spool of useless 8mm film, and a desire to disgust as many people as I could. Hey, if they won't love me, maybe they'll at least hate me, was the way I felt about it. Man, that sounds kind of serial killerish, doesn't it? As the months rolled by, I couldn't get the story out of my mind. I never did recapture the magic of that snowy night with Kathy, but I at least got her to semi-admit to a kind of attraction a year later. To this day, I'm not sure if she realizes what a big influence she had on my career. I think I'll send her a copy. I got home from school that summer and immediately made the legend of Frank Foley a priority. In a few short days, we rented a video camera and proceeded to put together 30 minutes of horrible acting, bad jokes, and even worse wrestling. Many people are familiar with the second movie we made called The Loved One, but it is a little-known fact that Dude Love actually made his first appearance in this fiasco. Dude Love was my fantasy creation of what a man was supposed to be. I never envisioned a freak like Mankind or a weirdo like Cactus Jack to be in the cards for me. No way. As a dude, I was going to be all the things that Mick Foley never was. Rich, successful, and the recipient of more ass than a toilet seat. The Loved One was taped in the 3 days spanning January 11th through the 13th in 1985. It was essentially a retelling of the Frank Foley movie, but with several added plot twists and much greater technical expertise. It was still so bad that I have never allowed my wife to see it, and when the World Wrestling Federation years later wanted to put the dude tape on the tube, I gave them access only to the wrestling scenes. The movie climaxes with the deadly backyard match, set in the Zucker backyard as passing cars whiz by us in that cold January morning. The Grand Lizard, which was Danny Zucker's wrestling name, was calling the action along with Steve Zangri, and the Lizard had a list of 30 wrestling cliches on a piece of paper to refer to liberally throughout the match. My opponent for the big match was Danny's younger brother, Teddy, who was using the name Big Dick Zuck and who used wrestling's most devastating maneuver, sodomy. "Look at this," the Lizard yelled. "A lot of guts, pride, and intestinal fortitude." Then the dude pulled the ladder from the side of the house and began climbing slowly as the camera showed Big Dick on the landing pad. "Look at Foley, he must be 50, 60, 70 feet in the air," Liz dramatically stated in what had to be one of the greatest exaggerations in sports entertainment history. "He will die tonight." With that, the dude took off from the roof of the circa 1878 Zucker house, which was probably a legitimate 13 feet in the air. The dive was completely inspired and was actually performed without a whole lot of fear. The fact that Big Dick rolled out of the way and avoided certain injury did nothing to taint the beautiful leap. With dude in a daze, Big Dick covered the champ, and referee Scott Dara put down his beer in time to make the 3 count. There was a new champion, but Big Dick wasn't done with the loved one just yet. In a flash, he bent dude over, pulled down his shorts, and appeared to violate the former champ with one quick thrust. "Oh, it's the sodomized! Dude Love has been sodomized!" A frantic Lizard yelled as his man rolled around in agony, having been busted wide open in a sense never meant for pro wrestling. Thanks to the magic of clumsy editing, it appeared as if blood was soaking through the dude's long gray underwear and shorts ensemble. Like most people who are the victim of an uninvited anal intrusion, the pain the loved one was feeling was at least 50% mental, and in his shame, he takes off through the woods while the Lizard follows, shouting, "Dude, dude, come back, dude," as my friends laugh hysterically. When we were 19 and drunk in my parents' house, none of us ever dreamed that our little movie, or at least portions of it, would be seen by millions across the world. I also had no idea that the loved one would allow me to get my foot in the door to the world of sports entertainment. In March 1985, my dad called me with exciting news. Professional wrestling was coming to Ward Melville High School. I talked to the promoter, my dad told me, and he said that if you come to the show, he would talk to you about becoming a wrestler. Man, I couldn't wait. It was going to be a loaded up card, and I was going to be there. I drove the 5 hours from Cortland, New York, in nervous anticipation of what the evening would have in store for me. I arrived at the Melville Gym, now the Jack Foley Gym, at around 3 o'clock as the ring was just arriving. My dad introduced me to promoter Tommy D., a man with all the flash and sizzle of a UPS delivery truck. I asked D about becoming a wrestler, but he didn't offer any encouragement. "You have to find somebody to train you," is all he said. He then asked me if I had any wrestling videos, as the wrestlers might like to watch them in the dressing room. "Yes, sir, I've got a great collection of MSG matches," I informed the unsmiling Mr. D. "I'll go get them." I hurried home, picked out half a dozen videos, and started to walk out of my tiny room when I stopped and turned around. I looked at my desk and saw the loved ones sitting there with Dude Love on the front of the box and the words, "A Journey into Greatness." Without thinking why, I grabbed the tape and headed out the door. When I got back to the gym, a television monitor and VCR were waiting for me. Lacrosse practice was just letting out, and the guys who were sophomores when I was a senior were very happy to see me. "Hey, Mick," one of them said, "do you have that movie you guys made?" "Well, yeah, I do," I had to admit. "Can you put it in?" he asked me next. I started to stutter and stammer, but was soon overcome by shouts of encouragement that convinced me to have an impromptu screening. But I wasn't about to lose these impressionable young Foley fans with bad dialogue and acting, so I wisely fast-forwarded to the dude's first entrance. When the dude appeared on the screen, the high school kids actually cheered. The sound on the TV was up so loud that the room of students could all hear, and I guess the noise must have attracted more kids because a stream of them started flocking over to the television set. By the time the music video part of the film began, there were, without exaggeration, 100 high school athletes around me, and to every one of them, I was the man. At least at that moment I was. It may be the Jack Foley Gymnasium now, but in March 1985, I owned the place. The dude was on the screen throwing fake-looking chops. They were cheering. The dude was in a living room brawl with Ishmael, the Puerto Rican giant. More cheers. And when the dude opened up a can of whoop-ass and took the World Wrestling Federation gold, forget about it. The place went crazy. I looked around and I saw these high school kids, most of whom I didn't even know, cheering for a guy with a wig and long underwear. Then out of the corner of my eye, I spotted Tommy D, and he had a smile from ear to ear. All of a sudden, I wasn't just a college punk with a pipe dream of being a wrestler. I'm pretty good about reading people's faces, and his was an easy one. It read, "I've just discovered a star." Next, I fast-forwarded to the wrestling scene, and the partisan Ward Melville crowd shouted their approval. They cheered when the dude was on the attack, exploded when he flew off the roof, and howled with laughter as the violated dude ran off through the woods. I looked at Tommy D, and his huge smile told me that he had really dug the backyard match. Tommy approached me a little while later and asked if I would like to start working on his ring crew. "I run about 4 shows a month," he said in his thick New York accent. "If we get the ring set up in time, I'll get one of the veterans to work with you in the ring." That's my New York accent. My first Tommy D show was a memorable experience. I began the day by leaving Cortland at 4 a.m. and driving to the big yellow storage building in the middle of Brooklyn, a horrible yellow landmark in a horrible part of the city. I guess I should point out that even though I grew up in Long Island and watched shows in Madison Square Garden, I actually can't stand the city, especially Brooklyn, except for the pizza. I met Tommy at Big Yellow and was told my assignment for the day. I had to go up to the 8th floor of the building, take the ring out of storage, load it into a truck, drive the truck to a high school in Staten Island, set up the ring, tear it down when the night was over, drive it back to Big Yellow, unload it, load it into the freight elevator, unload it at the top, and load it into storage. I then drove the 5 hours back to school. I had left Cortland at 4 a.m. and returned 26 hours later and $25 richer before expenses. I will always be grateful for that day, however, because it was the day I met Dominic DeNucci. I had seen Dominic wrestle as a kid and had seen him defend the tag titles on 2 different occasions. He spoke on TV with a heavy Italian accent, and I soon learned that the accent, like much of wrestling itself, was no act. Here's my accent. "So, you want to be a wrestler?" DeNucci sarcastically asked. That turned out to be a common question as he tested my will many times in the coming months. "I tell you what," he offered, "I'll step into the corner and I want you to give me a forearm." Wow, this was going to be easy. I had seen forearms thrown 1,000 times and I knew just what to do. "Are you ready?" I asked. "Come on, kid, show me what you got," came the reply. This is a horrible accent. "Okay," I warned him and reared back with my right arm while simultaneously lifting my left foot. "Stop!" My foot came down in perfect synchronization with my forearm and made a huge noise. It was good and I knew it. There were a couple of other wrestlers watching this training session and I knew that they knew it was good. Apparently, DeNucci didn't know that I knew that they knew it was good and told me a piece of advice that I will never forget. Actually, he told me quite a few things that I would never forget. "Kid, don't think that this is all the bullshit like you see on TV. This was a definite downer. This is how you throw a forearm," he declared, and then reared back with his massive arm and trunk, delivering a huge blow across my upper chest. I felt like my breastbone was going to cave in. "So you want to be a wrestler?" he sneered, as he proceeded to pummel me with 5 more consecutive smashes that left me longing for John Alt's lectures. I heard DeNucci laughing, I heard myself gasping, and I heard the sickening thud of a 50-year-old man's bare forearm across my t-shirted flesh. I did not, however, hear one foot stomping. "That, my boy," said a proud DeNucci, "is how you throw a forearm." I knew right then that I had learned a valuable lesson. I looked at DeNucci, and I knew that he knew that I knew I had learned a valuable lesson. I looked up at the small group of wrestlers, and I knew that they knew that Dominic knew that I knew I had just learned a valuable lesson. Looking back at the Brooklyn forearm incident, I really wish that I had made my first blow count a little more. It was the last offensive move I would get in for 4 months. Dominic was not an easy guy to impress, and when he was impressed, he wasn't real big on compliments. I guess that's why it meant so much to me when he finally started praising me. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't like he was cold-hearted. He was just more likely to say, "It was not bad," about something that had gone well. I did find out, however, that he'd been impressed with my ability to get up after taking a backdrop. I give it that kid from New York a 10 a backdrop, and he must have a ball of this a big, with his hands showing the size of a grapefruit, because he kept getting up. I later heard he said that about our first training sessions. After a marathon backdrop session, Dominic talked to me alone in the dressing room, and I guess for the first time realized not only how much this wrestling thing meant to me, but also that I may have possessed the testicular fortitude to see it through. I train some boys in Pittsburgh, he informed me, adding, if you really want to learn, maybe you should come there. I was flattered, but thought that DiNucci's school might pose a problem. I appreciate that, Dominic, I replied, but I really don't have much money to pay you. DiNucci nodded in understanding and quickly told me, you come to Pittsburgh and we can work something out. He then gave me the single best piece of advice I ever received in wrestling, and maybe in life in general. Don't think you are going to make a living doing this bullshit. I nodded blankly and listened intently as he offered up his only stipulation. You a college boy. You stay in school or else I don't train you. Over the years, I have passed this along to every hopeful wrestler I have ever encountered. The chances for success in this strange business are so slim that a college education is absolutely essential. So in the beginning of 1986, I headed to the Pittsburgh suburbs of Freedom, Pennsylvania for the first of about 70 road trips. If I'd known that Pittsburgh was 400 miles from Cortland, I might very well have declined Dominic's offer. However, by the time my dad handed me the AAA triptych, I had already committed. I will freely admit to being scared as hell about my first trip to Freedom. I had driven down the day before and stayed at the $16 a night Admiral Perry Motor Lodge, which is now a Toyota dealership, at the point where Interstate 80 intersects with Interstate 79. I had absolutely no offensive moves in my repertoire, unlike the list of 4 I've been using for the last 3 years, no confidence, and $100 to my name. However, I had learned how to bump. And as with most things, I learned by practice, and more practice. I walked into DiNucci's school in Freedom and meekly met the other trainees. The school was actually in the gym of the old Freedom Elementary School, which had been abandoned. It had no heat in the winter, and as I would find out, no air conditioning in the summer. What it did have, however, was Dominic DiNucci and 4 hungry students who wanted to learn. It was with great interest and great trepidation that I met my fellow trainees, Dave Klebansky, Kurt Kaufman, Troy Martin, and John Pamphilis. After my hellos, DiNucci brought me into the ring. This is a Mickey. He's from New York. He's a green, but he take a dece bump. Dece was Dominic's way of saying decent. That last part of the quote did me in, that part about take a dece bump. He might as well have put meatloaf underwear on me and walked me past a pack of wild dogs. The 4 students then proceeded to bump me without mercy for most of the next 3 hours. I was slammed, hip-tossed, suplexed, and back body dropped so many times I couldn't even afford to guess how many. I was both physically and mentally exhausted when Dominic asked to speak to me after my Sunday workout. Kid, we need to talk about the money, he said flatly. How much do you think you should have paid? This was uncomfortable to me, especially the part about me suggesting a price. Even today, I hate to be asked how much money I want. I would much rather shoot down an offer and make a counteroffer for much more than flat out request the same amount. I had heard that DiNucci's school was $100 a day. I didn't even have $100 period, let alone per day, so I decided to shoot low with the veteran and said, how about 50? He thought it over and shook his head. No, he said, I can't do that. My heart sank before he continued his dismissal. It's too high. How about 25? Even at the discounted rate I had so shrewdly bargained for, I knew that I couldn't continue to throw money around like I had, so I began skimping on certain things like food and lodging. The era of the jar of peanut butter and the loaf of bread was ushered in. Even at $16 a night, I knew I couldn't afford both Friday and Saturday night in a motel, so Fridays officially became car night. I threw 2 sleeping bags into the back seat of my Ford Fairmont, where they stayed for the next year and a half. I would leave Cortland at 10 p.m. every Friday night for the 8-hour trip to freedom, giving myself 6 extra hours to rest. If I made it all the way, I would park at the gym and sleep in front of it. If I got tired along the way, I would simply pull over at a hotel and park in the lot, curl up, and catch a nap. Sometimes the guys would get to the school and have to wake me up. Often the car would be covered in snow and I would emerge like a bear from hibernation, ready to rumble. I actually enjoyed my backseat bed, as I was very aware that this was part of my paying my dues, and as I kept reminding myself in 10-degree weather, it was building character. It seems to have worked, and I can honestly say that one of the great comforts in my life is that I feel completely deserving of all the good things that have come my way in the last few years. I know for a fact that I earned them. After about 4 trips to Dominic's, I found I really only had 2 problems. 1, I sucked at pro wrestling, and 2, I hated it. After my big Ward Melville Dude Love debut, everything had been downhill. Now at Dominic's, I was finally getting to try some offensive moves and couldn't cut the mustard. Even the simplest things were confusing to me. Doing a hip toss was like doing algebra. I didn't have a clue. A schoolboy roll-up might as well have been nuclear physics, and a drop toe hold, brain surgery. Thankfully, after a long time, the fog began to lift, and I began to learn, and in turn, began to enjoy myself. I credit my turnaround to hard work and perseverance, but above all else, the dedication of that old summon a bitch, Dominic DeNucci. I think Dominic saw me as his special project, as if he wanted to see if combining my thimble full of talent and my ball of this a big could somehow turn out a decent pro. My first match was in Clarksburg, West Virginia on June 24th, 1986. Man, this was nerve-wracking. To be in the prestigious Clarksburg Armory alongside such wrestling luminaries as Jerry the Wanderer McIntyre, Bill Berger, Lord Zoltan, Buddy Donovan, and Irish Mike McGee was all I could have ever hoped for. I sought out ring announcer Hank Hudson to give him my statistics. You're one of DeNucci's students, aren't you? The velvet-tongued Hudson asked. Yes, Mr. Hudson, I am, I replied. Okay, what's your name? Hudson inquired. Actually, Hank Hudson's voice is nowhere near that deep, but it's the only imitation I can do. That was a tough one. I wanted to be Dude Love, but I knew that I didn't have the experience or the talent to be the dude just yet. Maybe in another 6 months. In the meantime, I needed another name while I developed the poise to be the dude. I thought back to a fantasy wrestling game that I had ordered a few years earlier, in which I had been Mick Big Train Foley and my dad had been Cactus Jack. So when Hank asked me my name, Cactus Jack was the answer that came out. Where are you from, Cactus Jack? The veteran ring announcer / postal worker asked next. Bloomingdale, Indiana, came my weak reply. Hudson quickly showed why he earned the big bucks by responding, I don't think there's any cactuses in Indiana. What about Arizona? Okay, I agreed. Is Tucson, Arizona good? Now, Tucson would have been just fine, but not to a man like Hank Hudson, whose postal training had exposed him to every hometown under the sun. Isn't there a truth or consequences in Arizona? His voice is getting deeper. Hank asked my blank face. Oh, no, he corrected himself. That's Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. The new hometown fit like the pants of a man with 5 penises, like a glove. I liked the hometown so much that I kept it for the next 12 years. I kept the Cactus Jack thing longer than expected, too. Luckily, I don't remember much of the match, although whether it was due to the injury or selective memory, I'm not certain. I do know that I lost the match and that the show in Clarksburg was the first day that I met Brian Hildebrand. Brian was a manager that night, although of whom I can't recollect. At one time or another, Brian managed everybody in the West Virginia, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania area. I believe the show in Clarksburg was his final one as Dr. Jaime Schwartz, as he spent the next 13 years as Mark Curtis. When he came to DeNucci's the next day, it was obvious that he was far more than just a manager. At 140 pounds, he was one of the most well-rounded wrestlers I had ever seen. Brian had the ability to work any style, from brawling to technical to high-flying. He was studying Japanese tapes and attempting their moves long before I knew such things existed. Over the summer of 1986, I was developing a strong friendship with one of DiNucci's trainees, Troy Martin. Brian was my manager for the next few years, and his help was invaluable. From that summer of 1986 until his untimely death in the fall of 1999 from stomach cancer, he would remain my best friend in the business. DiNucci now had several students, and many of them seemed to think that they would learn by proxy, as if all that was required was their presence in the gym to improve. Getting in the ring, it sometimes seemed, was not a prerequisite for success. For some of them, DiNucci's became a place to joke around. For me and Troy, who had made something of a pact that summer, the gym became a place to make our dreams come true. By the time the summer ended, I not only had a partner to develop moves and matches with, I also had a place to stay every Saturday. Friday was still car night because I could never guarantee the time of my arrival, but Troy and his mom proceeded to house me almost every Saturday after that. As the summer came to a close, I was actually starting to show some potential and was elated to get a mid-August call from DiNucci. "Vince, I need some boys to do the TV in Providence," DiNucci's unmistakable voice informed me. "Do you want to do?" I was dumbfounded. I ran into Vince McMahon, the CEO of the World Wrestling Federation, in the gym in Providence, and we spotted each other on the bench press. I helped him squeeze out a couple of extra reps by yelling, "Feel that pump, Vince, feel it burn." Afterward, he thanked me and told me he'd been following me on the independent scene for a long time. Actually, he just said a quick hello in a 2-second encounter that he forgot as soon as it was over. For some reason, I just like the sound of the first story better. When I got to the Civic Center in Providence, I basically stood around and stared at all the stars I had been watching on television and in the arenas for years. I wish I had possessed the dude's confidence and charisma, but instead I just sat in the room like a slug. Sometime later, Pat Patterson, of current Stooge fame, asked to speak to me. Pat informed me that along with my partner for the night, Les Thornton, I would be taking on the British Bulldogs, Davey Boy Smith and Dynamite Kid, who were the current tag team champions. I went out to the ring and started yelling at the fans. There was a whole world of difference between the 300 who were scattered about the armory in Clarksburg and the 18,000 who jammed the Civic Center in Providence, so I actually had a little bit of a rush going through my body when the fans responded to my verbal taunting. The Bulldogs came to the ring accompanied by Captain Lou Albano in their Royal English entrance theme. I began to feel slightly out of my element. When the match started, I knew instantly that I was in trouble. Les Thornton was, like the Bulldogs, an English wrestler and a technical expert. For 2 minutes, he and Davey did some fine technical wrestling, and then Davey tagged the Dynamite Kid, and Les tagged the scared 20-year-old kid, being me. An announcement might as well have been made saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, the scientific part of the match has just concluded, but please stay tuned for a major ass whipping." It was devastating. I began the match, and right off the bat, in accordance with my previous wishes, I was snap suplexed nearly out of my boots. A snapmare came next, followed by a diving headbutt so painful that I could see my eyes crossing on the video replay. As I struggled to get to my feet, Davey Boy was tagged in to resume the fun. A big horizontal suplex and a power slam followed, but hey, these were both moves I'd endured countless times at DiNucci's gym, and when Smith hooked me in a loose front facelock, I figured it was my time to have some fun. I immediately began firing weak-looking elbows at his midsection in a quest to get in my big elbow on national television. Davey could have no doubt clamped down on the hold and shut me down completely, but instead he let me go. Knowing Davey as I do now, I think he was probably just getting a kick out of my youthful exuberance and wanted to see where it would take us. It took us right to the ropes, where I fired off my amused opponent and caught him coming off the opposite strands with my big flying elbow. I'd done it! I had landed my big move on Federation television. Sadly, instead of the ooh or ah that I felt such a devastating move would merit, I heard laughter and looked up to see Smith smiling. One headbutt later, which thankfully didn't hurt, Davey tagged out and a fired-up Dynamite Kid came in with bad intentions in his mind. Dynamite had broken into wrestling as a skinny 15-year-old kid in England, where for years he'd been told he was too small to make the big time. As a result, he had worked harder and become more vicious in the ring than anyone I've ever seen. I also believe he had a genuine mean streak in him. With 225 pounds of muscle packed onto a frame that was probably never meant to hold more than 180, he was a devastating mental and physical presence. Looking back on it, I honestly think that he saw my weak attempt at offense as a slap in the face, and his body started physically shaking on the ring apron as he begged for the tag. When he tagged in, there is no doubt in my mind now, as I believe there was none in his then, that he planned to hurt me. He shot me into the ropes and followed me a half step behind the whole way. When I came off the ropes, he clubbed me across the jaw with his biceps, in which I guess was technically a clothesline. I never saw it coming, and the effect was devastating. Pain shot from the tip of my jaw through my ears. Then, with my ears still ringing and my head pounding, I was suplexed backward off the top rope and fell in an awkward way onto my shoulders and the back of my head. As future Minnesota Governor Jesse the Body Ventura called the slow-motion replay, I could see Dynamite looking back at me with a combined look of concern and satisfaction. I was helped to the back by one of the referees, and when I got there, saw a look on veteran wrestlers' faces that was comparable to that of an observer of a car wreck. Even Greg Valentine, whose career had not exactly been characterized by touching displays of affection, gave me a concerned, "Are you okay, brother?" "Do you know where the Bulldogs are?" was my only reply. "They went in there, brother." Valentine smiled, and I could see others raising their eyebrows in surprise at what they probably viewed as the beginning of some stupid retaliatory locker room attempt. I have since seen many a locker room incident over wrestlers taking liberties on their opponents, and if anyone had just cause to be a little bit peeved, it would be me. I opened the door and saw them standing there together, looking like the cumulative cat who had swallowed the canary. I didn't hesitate a bit in telling them what was on my mind. "Thank you very much," I said, while shaking hands with both men. "I really appreciate it." They smiled with a touch of disbelief and let me know that they, too, had enjoyed themselves. I traveled to Hartford, Connecticut for the second set of World Wrestling Federation tapings. They had been in attendance in Providence and wanted to tell me how much they enjoyed my match. "Great job out there," my dad informed me. "Your mother was so impressed that she even put her book down when you went out." I gave them a thank you, but I guess my dazed eyes gave me away, and my concerned mother asked me if I was all right. "Well, my jaw is really hurting and I can't close my mouth or eat food, but other than that, I guess I'm all right." My mom seemed stunned and offered the same sentiment that I had heard so many times before. But I thought it was all fake. Even in my clouded state, I offered up words that were a pretty good synopsis of the previous night. "Mom, nothing has ever felt so real in my life." I don't think my mother has enjoyed a match since then. Certainly not an Al Snow match. Even to this day, she will tape my matches and then only watch them when she finds out I'm all right. During my senior year in college, a time when most guys are having the time of their lives, I spent 28 out of 32 weekends in Freedom, Pennsylvania, or whatever small town I happened to be wrestling in. And believe me, I wrestled in some small ones. Maybe the low point of my career was our big event in Polka, West Virginia, at the Polka High School, home of the Polka Dots. Yes, the team's name was the Dots. Now that must have sent a shiver down the spines of countless opponents. The trip started out in fine form with me, Troy, Brian, and Dominic all in the same car having a jolly good time. Actually, a lot of the times were good ones back then, despite the fact that I was beaten up, financially destitute, and couldn't get laid if I was in a women's prison with a fistful of weekend passes. There was just an innocence to it then because my motives were so pure. I loved wrestling, plain and simple. Now, with wrestling hotter than it's ever been, I tend to look at it as a business and don't want to risk too much on any given night. Whereas back in those days, I'd put it all on the line no matter what the attendance was. Polka, however, was pushing it. We got to the building, there were only 2 cars and a ring truck there. "Maybe we're early," I cheerfully said to Brian, who with several years under his belt knew better. "Cactus, think of this as a practice session that you will make $10 for. In Polka, West Virginia, in front of exactly 26 people, and I know because I counted them when I was out there. Troy and I had a full dress rehearsal and gave the people who were either dumb or lucky enough to be there a match that was probably better than half the stuff that's currently on WCW pay-per-view. At that time, I was just starting to be a high-impact risk taker, and I took risks on that empty gym floor that I wouldn't take later on Raw tapings. We drove back 200 miles to freedom, elated from the match instead of deflated from the bomb scare, a poorly attended match, in Polka. I spent my $10 payoff at a Rack's restaurant, and there wasn't a sour face at the table. Even Dominic was happy, looking at his boys. Somewhere around this time, Dominic pulled me aside at the gym in Freedom. "How long have you been a-comin' here?" he wanted to know. "I don't know," I began, before adding, I guess about 9 months. "And all of this time you have been a-paying me, right?" he added in what seemed like a strange tone of voice. I didn't know where he was coming from, and I wasn't sure I liked it. Dominic then eased my mind. "I tell you what, from now on you don't pay me. What you have done is take a ball about this big," now it was basketball-sized, "and you don't need to pay me anymore." So for the next year, I went to Dominic's free of charge. I learned and improved a great deal that year. Dominic had a spot open on a trip to West Africa 1 week after I graduated from Cortland. Burkina Faso was a third world country that had previously been known as Upper Volta, of Upper and Lower and Travolta fame, and it was trying to change its image. The tour was actually booked through a friend of the country's president, Thomas Sankara, who had already done quite a bit to improve his impoverished country. Professional wrestling was one of many things that summer, including a concert by Kool and the Gang and an appearance by Muhammad Ali that were to be provided to entertain the citizens of Burkina. Because the tour was guaranteed by the government, we were to be paid $1,500 a week for the 2-week trip. I was overjoyed. $3,000 was a lot of money for someone just out of college. In actuality, it was more money than I'd made in my 2 years in the business. Only a very small percentage of all Burkina citizens had access to television, so to advertise the matches, it was decided that we would provide the city access to us. All the wrestlers were loaded onto the back of a flatbed truck where we were put on display for the next 8 hours while a recorded message blared over the loudspeakers. On that truck, for damn near all the city to see, stood one of the worst collections of pro wrestlers ever assembled. Besides Danucci and 5 of his trainees, including me, stood Power Udi, the Nigerian champ, who was as rude and untalented as he was muscular, Mr. Haiti, a co-promoter of the trip, Butch Cassidy and his midget opponent, the Haiti Kid, George Espada, a grizzled Puerto Rican whose claims to being a great wrestler turned out to be a figment of his imagination, and a few other lost souls who, odds are, will never have their own action figures. By the time we got to the National Soccer Stadium at the end of the 3rd day, stomachs were rumbling and spirits were low. There were almost no cars in the parking lot, but a few thousand bikes were lined up as we made our way to the dressing rooms. I wrestled Dominic that night in front of 10,000 Burkina fans, which is an impressive number for a regular show, but not for a stadium that held 60,000. Not to worry, we were assured by Belozi Harvey, our chief promoter, a man so close to Sankara that he named his son after the president. This is a political trip, and President Sankara is personally guaranteeing that all of you will be paid. The tour went downhill fast after that. Every day brought about an 8-hour bus ride over roads that Lewis and Clark probably would have had second thoughts about crossing. Our next stop was at a small soccer stadium with about 300 spectators. The next day drew approximately 60 fans to a small courtyard-like annex inside a large building. I remember the scene vividly. As a small family of bats congregated in a corner of the dressing room, we changed and considered the possibility of our payoff. Again, Belozi Harvey was there to reassure us all that this was no problem. The tour was guaranteed by the president, and we would all be paid after the tour. The sky looked threatening as the first match went into the ring and literally opened up pouring rain a few minutes after the bell rang. Both wrestlers hightailed it to the dressing room, followed by the fans. Yes, the fans. There we stood, the wrestlers, the 60 fans, and the family of bats for the next 45 minutes. When the sky cleared, the fans took their seats, and the show went on. By the time my 2 weeks were up, I couldn't wait to get home. When I got home, I wasn't the same for a long time. I suffered stabbing pains in my stomach and diarrhea for well over a month, but at least I had $3,000 to show for it, right? Well, not so fast. About a week after I got home, I was watching television. My dad was, as usual, reading the paper, and I'm sure there was some kind of ball game on television. Hey, Mick, I heard my dad say in a voice that sounded like it bore bad news. What was the name of that country you just wrestled in? Burkina Faso. Why, Dad? Was my quick answer to the quiz. Well, Mick, I think you better look at this, my dad answered back, and then actually made a special trip over to deliver the bad news. He handed me the paper and pointed to a heading in the Sunday World section of the New York Times. There in black and white was the end of my $3,000 dream. Government overthrown, president assassinated. I never did call Belozy Harvey about the status of my payoff, but I went under the assumption that the new government wasn't going to pick up the old administration's sports entertainment debts. I guess in retrospect, I had picked the wrong week to quit sniffing glue. In August of 1988, I headed to Tennessee to begin my first full-time wrestling job. The Championship Wrestling Association, or CWA, was better known simply as Memphis. Memphis was the city the entire territory worked around, with the Mid-South Coliseum being the site of weekly Monday night cards for a few decades. In addition, the Channel 5 TV studio hosted a Saturday morning wrestling TV show that was a local institution. The show aired live every Saturday in Memphis and then played a week later in the rest of the towns. The territory was run completely off the angles and storylines on television, and shows were run on a weekly basis in Nashville, Louisville, and Evansville. Other shows, called spot shows, were run on off days in various locations throughout Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, and parts of Arkansas. At one time, Memphis had been a hotbed of wrestling, with the alumni reading like a who's who of the mat game. Many were the times that a green wrestler came into the territory with nothing to offer but potential and left as a polished performer. The rapid pace of the television show, made necessary by the weekly shows in the towns, enabled a young wrestler to become immersed in angles and interviews, and most of the time a wrestler couldn't help but improve. For years, the Memphis territory was also a great place to make money, as the Mid-South Coliseum was a sellout much of the time, but fate hadn't been kind to the company in the past few years. Gone were the days of $1,500 paychecks, and it was common knowledge that most of the young guys had to get by on $300 a week or less. In general, my time in Memphis was every bit as valuable as it was miserable. No matter what I did, I never could please anyone. Actually, only one guy seemed to have faith in me, and that was Robert Fuller, who was later known as Colonel Parker in WCW and Tennessee Lee in the WWF. I used to ride to many of the towns with Rob, and it was kind of like sitting under the learning tree, because Rob had as good a head for the business as anyone. I learned a lot about what to do in the ring from Rob, but sadly learned just as much about what not to do outside of it. Rob and his brother Ron had both grown up in the business as second-generation stars. Both had booked, both worked, and for a time co-owned Continental Wrestling in Alabama. In actuality, Robert was the better performer and better talker, but somehow at a similar age, Ron was a multimillionaire and poor Rob lived week to week. I genuinely liked Rob, but his situation depressed me, and I made myself a promise that I wouldn't make the same financial mistakes he had. I believe Robert Fuller was the only guy I ever simultaneously looked up to and looked down on, but I can honestly say that without Rob's respect and support and the confidence they gave me, life may not have turned out quite the same for me. After 3 months in Tennessee, I headed to world-class championship wrestling in Texas. I enjoyed Texas every bit as much as I'd hated Tennessee. From the moment I limped into Dallas in the 1980 Plymouth Arrow that veteran wrestler Mike Davis had sold me when my Fairmont died, I seemed to take a liking to the state and its people. Or maybe it was the 40-year-old Australian lady who worked at the desk at the motel I stayed in during my first week in town. Seeing as how my wife hasn't even read my book and will probably never hear this, just imagine what this lady used to do to me. Whatever the case, Texas reaffirmed my faith in the wrestling business, and I grew by leaps and bounds while I was there. My first night in Dallas heralded a change in the Cactus Jack character. I'd always seemed more mischievous than insane, During my first interview in Dallas, I somehow went in the insane direction. The style was encouraged immediately. I took to the role quickly, however, and in my mind at least, became the best weirdo in wrestling, probably because, like most successful wrestling gimmicks, it wasn't much of a stretch. Crazy guys usually bothered me in wrestling simply because they were trying so hard to be crazy. They'd sit there and shake and make faces while their manager talked, and to me it all seemed so contrived and unbelievable. I was a nice madman, however, somewhat naive and simple-minded to tell the truth. Much as I'd done in Tennessee with my non-New York accent practice at local honky-tonks, I began practicing my new Cactus Jack at the local Dallas night spots. It was as Cactus Jack that I met a pretty divorced mother of two named Valerie. She had been to the Sportatorium for the first time that night with a friend, and when her friend approached me, Valerie became intrigued with me to the point that she invited me for dinner a few nights later. I only had one problem. I had met her as a nervous, paranoid, simple-minded Cactus Jack and didn't really know how to tell her that I wasn't really like the guy she had met. It was a hell of a predicament. Do I go as Mick Foley, explain the strange situation and hope for the best? Or do I continue my lie and go as Cactus Jack? Suddenly, a realization hit me. Valerie had not invited Mick Foley over. She had invited Cactus Jack. Like most chicks, she would not dig poor Mick, while Cactus had a reasonable shot at nailing her. So rather than come clean, I continued my lie as it would continue for the next several months. I would get up from my Cactus Jack performances and would need time to unwind when it was over. Hey, it's not easy being on for hours at a time. Valerie was my first long-term relationship, but unlike other guys who claim she never really knew me, I was correct. She never really knew me. Eventually, Valerie dropped me, claiming, among other things, substandard sexual techniques. But I showed her. After having a taste, I was like a kid in a candy store, and I went on a short run of rampant promiscuousness that proved one of two things. Either Valerie was wrong about me, or she had quite a few people who would agree with her. Eric Embry was our booker in Texas, and also doubled as top good guy. The guy had to be a genius because as a pudgy, sneaky heel, he was the last guy you'd think fans would love, but over time they went crazy over the guy. Actually, he was very bright, wrote good television, and could wrestle his ass off. He had one trait that bothered me a little, though. Eric, he liked to be naked. I had been told that Eric belonged to a nudist colony in Florida, and I believed it as he turned the Sportatorium dressing room into his own personal colony. He would walk around giving instruction with his Johnson blowing in the wind, and I'd have to pretend not to see it. It reminded me of talking to a girl with huge hooters, so I would have to keep my eyes glued on his so as not to look at his menacing member. Actually, if my shorts housed a hose like Embry's, maybe I too would be prone to presenting my penis in public. But alas, the Irish curse had struck me hard, and I know that I would be forever destined to walk to the shower with my towel around my waist. I can say this about Eric. He gave me a chance to do my best at a time when I was almost out of choices. I was never held back, never lectured about college, and never told to beg off from my opponent. He gave me the freedom to be myself, and I prospered with that gift. He also will go down as one of my favorite opponents. Even though my star was on the rise in Texas, I lived as if it had fallen and had been buried. I would call the place I lived in a dump, but it would be an insult to people who actually lived in dumps. As in Nashville, I paid $50 a week for my room, but unlike Nashville, this $50 also covered food, laundry, and auto repairs. Also, unlike Nashville, my $50 a week included sharing the house with the biggest variety of losers ever assembled under one roof. Compared to these guys, I was like the Fonz or something. Hey! I went home to New York for a visit with my family, and when I returned to Texas, I heard some strange news. I was booked for the following Saturday night in Fort Worth in a Scaffold match. A Scaffold match is a wonder of stupidity that some genius thought up in Memphis that had since made the rounds in Texas and Jim Crockett's old NWA territory. The object of the match was simple. knock your opponent off the scaffold. World Class bragged that they had the highest scaffold in the wrestling world. It had to be more than 20, maybe even 25 feet high. I thought back to an offhand comment Embry had made months earlier. Would you be willing to do a scaffold match? He had nonchalantly asked, to which I had nonchalantly said, sure. Now, however, it didn't seem like such a good idea. A day before the match, I got a surprise phone call. The voice was frantic. Jack, please don't do this match, it yelled. It was Valerie, the girl who had dumped me, and I paused for a few moments to get myself in Cactus Jack mode. Why? I asked, waiting for some more of this outpouring of emotion. Because you're going to get hurt and I don't want you to get hurt, was her reply. Not bad, a lot of anguish in her voice, but I was going to make her pay for daring to suggest a sexual inadequacy on my part. I'm sorry, it's too late, I replied. It's already been booked. There's nothing I can do about it. Yes, there is, Valerie cried. Tell them that you can't do it. Oh, this was great, and now, it seemed, was the perfect time for a little sarcasm. What do you want me to do, Valerie? I asked. Tell them that I can't do it because my ex-girlfriend won't let me? Yes, she yelled. Tell them anything. Just don't go up there. I'm sorry, I replied in much sadness before adding, and Valerie, in case anything happens to me up there, I want to say, good luck. She was crying when she hung up the phone. I showed her no one, and I mean no one, makes fun of my little buddy and gets away with it. Yes! When I climbed up the scaffold, I immediately felt a rush of adrenaline, partially because I knew that potential for injury was high. I can only compare it to standing atop the Hell in a Cell in June 1998, and unfortunately the results would be comparable as well. I really can't remember a damn thing about the match except being pile-driven on the scaffold and rolling over to my belly to prepare for the drop. Are you ready, baby? Embry asked as he delivered a boot to the head that eased me halfway off the structure. Yeah, I said weakly as the ring below me appeared very far away. I may have said, yeah, but in reality, I had no idea what to do. I knew what I was supposed to do, hang until ready, then drop and crumple upon impact so as not to ruin my knees. Sadly, I sensed that my goal would be unobtainable because as I supported myself with one elbow, I could see that I had nothing to hang on to. Everything I saw was much longer than my hand and impossible to grip. I really didn't see how I could hang. 20 feet in the air was not the best place to be for a kid who could never do pull-ups in gym class. I was swinging my legs when Embry kicked me and my elbow hold gave way. I must have been on a backward swing because when I dropped, I began to free fall face first, picking up speed and heading for disaster. As I was about to land, I put my hand down to block the fall and then landed in a heap, breaking my wrist in the process. It was a good minute before I moved. I tried to stand quickly and I fell down. 2 more wrestlers came from the back and together helped me make my way to the dressing room. After sitting for a half hour, I tried to change but found it very hard to do so. A good hour after the match had ended, I walked out to my Plymouth Arrow with the dented, unusable door and saw a small congregation of well-wishers gathered there. Among them were Valerie and her 2 kids. It was obvious that all 3 had been crying. I'm sorry, Jack, she cried. Can you forgive me? Sure, I said, and then in a true example of class, I treated her and the kids to Jack in the Box, where against my wishes, the kids ordered sodas instead of free tap water. About this time, I received word from my friend Flamboyant Freddie Fargo that Jim Ross was interested in bringing me into Ted Turner's World Championship Wrestling. I was thrilled. This, I felt, was the answer to my dreams. I got the number from Freddie and anxiously called Ross, who was the head of the WCW booking committee. Ross informed me that the company was going to be looking for new talent after the summer and that I was high on their list. It was the greatest news of my career. Yes! 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 2 weeks later, I received bad news in the form of a wrestling newsletter whose headline read, Ross resigns from booking committee. My heart sank past my stomach into my testicular region. No! 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 Toward the middle of the summer, I started to get the gut feeling that it was time to leave. Part of World Class's appeal was also its drawback, as its large syndication size ensured good visibility, but also ensured a large viewing audience for my recent losing efforts. I really felt like these losses were going to hurt me long term, and I certainly wasn't being paid enough to compensate for throwing my career away. Besides, the constant pounding was making it impossible for my wrist to heal. With a heavy heart, I approached Embry and told him I thought it was time to leave. I had envisioned great things for my send-off at the Dallas Sportatorium. I had performed in that building over 70 times in my 9 months and had engaged in some tremendous matches. I wanted to give the fans a great match to remember me by and had my head loaded with ideas as I drove to Valerie's for what would prove to be the last time I saw her. The match had been booked as a loser leaves town match, and I intended to leave right from the Sportatorium and drive on through the night. Over dinner, I speculated about the match and saw her become slightly angry as she yelled, "Jack, I know you're going to lose tonight." This surprised me, as I had always tried to protect the business around her and had steadfastly denied knowing the outcomes to my matches. I decided to call her bluff. "What makes you say that?" I inquired, using the poker face I had honed to perfection years earlier at late-night card games in childhood friend Scott Biasetti's basement. Her reply was simple and her rationale was hard to argue with. "Jack, I'm looking out the window at your car, and you've got everything you own in it. I know you're going to lose." She then asked if I was going to come back for her, and I had to admit that it probably would never happen. My classic farewell match never happened either, as I lost to Embry in 9 seconds with a simple backslide, then walked up the aisle as the fans sang "Hit the Road, Jack, and Don't You Come Back No More." I actually had tears in my eyes as I pulled out of the parking lot and didn't stop for rest until I was in my old bed in East Setauket 27 hours later. I healed up for a month and then headed to Alabama, where Robert Fuller was in charge of the Continental Wrestling Association. After 3 months, it was announced that the company would be folding. It was during this trying time that I received a phone call from Troy Martin, who was now wrestling as Shane Douglas for Ted Turner's World Championship Wrestling. Shane asked how I was, and I told him of the imminent closing down of the company. "Why don't you come to a TV taping in Atlanta?" Shane suggested. "Hell, it's only 3 hours away. This way you can at least get your face seen." I quickly agreed, and a week later drove to the Center Stage Theater in Atlanta, Georgia. The Center Stage was like a whole new world when I walked in. I felt strangely like I had during my first day in the World Wrestling Federation dressing room back in 1986 as I watched all the big stars walk by. Just then, Jim Ross came into view. Although no longer part of the booking committee, Ross was still WCW's play-by-play man, and he was taking a break between 2 tapings. He spotted me, walked over, and with less than full enthusiasm gave me a quick, "Cactus Jack, are you still alive?" before heading into the dressing room. Needless to say, it was not quite the greeting I had been hoping for. A minute later, however, Ross reappeared with Booker and 5-time, at that time, world champion Ric Flair. I should point out now that Flair had 2 separate stints as the Booker, one in 1989 through 1990 and one in 1994. Suddenly, Ross, who I thought had just blown me off, was singing my praises to the Nature Boy. "Rick, this is Cactus Jack," he said. "He's a hell of a worker, a hell of a talker," which was actually debatable, "and he takes some great bumps." Flair took it all in before asking, "What are you doing in 2 weeks there?" Flair is one of the best imitations I do, actually. I was tongue-tied for a moment before using my much-heralded mic skills to say, nothing. When I arrived back at Center Stage 2 weeks later, I looked at the lineup sheet and felt all of my visualization become devisualized. There in black and white for all the world to see were the following words: R. Fargo and Cactus Jack versus the Steiners. This wasn't going to be a tryout. It was going to be a slaughter. The Steiners weren't just wrestlers. They punished you. Was this really all they thought of me? I felt suddenly as if all my suffering had been for nothing. Was even contemplating packing up and leaving when Jim Cornette and Kevin Sullivan approached me. Hey, brother, nice to meet you, Sullivan said in his native Boston accent. What's your finish? I had no idea what he was talking about, but he gave a confused answer. I drop an elbow. An elbow? Sullivan groaned. Brother, what kind of a finish is that? Luckily for me, Cornette jumped to my defense. And Kevin, goddamn, you got to see it. It's the damnedest thing you've ever seen. He comes running down the apron and drops the elbow right on the concrete. Sullivan seemed impressed. You drop an elbow on the concrete, brother? He asked. I tell you what, he offered. After your match with the Steiners, I want you to drop that elbow on your partner. Got it, brother? No matter what Ricky or Scott do to you, I want you to get up and drop that effing elbow on your partner. But he didn't say effing. From now on, I will use the word effing as opposed to the F-U-C-K-I-N in case there are small children in your car. When I tagged in Fargo, the Steiners put him through a quick series of torturous tumbles and ended the match. I waited until they left for my big chance to shine. Here I go. I helped Fargo to his feet in an act of mock consideration. Once the poor guy was erect, no, not that way, you pervert, I let him have it. A series of forearms to the head were followed by a toss out of the ring where I continued to pursue him on the floor. I picked up Fargo, carried him a few steps, executed a backbreaker, and deposited him suddenly on the cold, concrete floor. Eagerly, I hopped back up on the ring apron, turned around, and got ready to pounce. Oh my God, I thought in panic. I'll never reach him. Without exaggeration, Fargo was at least 17 feet from the ring. Bob Beeman or Carl Lewis would have had trouble reaching him, let alone Mick Foley, who at a height of 6'4", had barely grazed the rim of a basketball hoop a single time. What could I do? I thought about an alternative, but quickly realized that I couldn't possibly jump down, pull him in closer, jump up on the apron, and do it again. Instead, I took a deep breath, took my two-step approach, and pushed off with as much force as my legs could provide. I came up about 1 foot short and landed hard on my hip with a huge thud, but caught Fargo with my outstretched arm. All in all, it was a pretty impressive debut, and my adrenaline surged when I felt the reaction of the crowd. When the taping was over, I was approached by Sullivan and Flair. Sullivan was not shy about his high ambitions for me, and Flair seemed impressed, if slightly stoic. We're going to put you on the road in about a month, sir, Flair informed me. In the meantime, we'd like you to make our next TV tapings in the Carolinas. I'm not sure what you'll be making, but it will probably be in the neighborhood of $1,000 a week. I can't guarantee that, but I can guarantee that you'll be making a comfortable living. Comfortable my ass. At $1,000 a week, I would be rich! Sure enough, for the first time in my life, my bank account started to grow. Aside from my road expenses, which were around $100 a day, I had few bills to pay because I lived with my parents and was regularly putting away $1,000 a week. I was wrestling hard, having fun, and in my mind at least, I was one wealthy SOB. Actually, after 5 years in the business, I had pulled in a grand total of $30,000 before my WCW stint, so I probably had several $1,500 weeks to go before I could even qualify as destitute. My fortunes started taking a turn for the worse in mid-April in Columbus, Ohio. I was teaming with Kevin against Rick Ryder and someone else whose name escapes me at the moment. We had what I thought was a very enjoyable match, concluding with an elbow on Ryder, who was as far away, if not farther, than Rick Fargo had been 4.5 months earlier. Rick Ryder has just had his pancreas punished, Cornette yelled in response to the big elbow, which was honestly just a wrist and 4 fingers making contact because he had been so far away. I was happy about the match, but my positive feelings soon turned to shock when I ran into Ric Flair, who had been waiting for me. Flair had just resigned as booker, and I guess he decided to take his frustration and anger out of me. What the hell are you doing out there? Flair demanded. I didn't know what to say. Hell, I didn't even know what the question meant, and I told Flair so. I mean, you do all that shit, and just because those two, and he pointed to Ross and Cornette on the television monitor, put you over, you think you're over. Don't you understand no one cares about you? I was floored. All I could do was stare blindly as the nature boy continued his condemnation. "You'll be in a wheelchair by the time you're 30, he scoffed, and followed it up with another bit of sentiment in "Nobody's going to care." I've thought about that night in Columbus at least 1,000 times since it happened. For several years, I thought about it every day, and as I approached my 30th birthday in 1996, I became obsessed with it. I felt strongly enough about it to do an interview on the subject on the eve of my 30th birthday, which the Wrestling Observer newsletter called one of the greatest ever in wrestling. A short while ago, I ran into Flair, who congratulated me on how well I'd done and then said, "Geez, Cactus, you need to slow down so you don't get hurt. Do you remember when I told you you were going to be in a wheelchair by the time you were 30? I told him that I remembered very well. For a few weeks, WCW went ahead without a lead booker. When I found out who the new booker was, I was wishing Flair had never left, Columbus dressing room incident or not. Ole Anderson was a wrestling traditionalist who hadn't shown a whole lot of enthusiasm for my character or my style since I met him. I felt like I knew that my days were numbered, so I decided to have a talk with Ole. I gave him my 1 month's notice. He didn't exactly beg me to reconsider. I finished up on June 10th, 1990 in Hollywood, Florida, and flew home the next day, feeling like I could take on the world. My name had gotten around to several independent promoters, and I already had several bookings lined up. I was ready to enter into the next phase of my career. One of my first independent matches after my WCW exit was for my first wrestling boss, Tommy D. The show was to be held on July 7th at the Riverhead Raceway in eastern Long Island, about 30 miles from my house. Because of my close proximity to the venue, I agreed to hand out flyers at the races on the previous Saturday afternoon to help build up the matches that were set for 6 days later. It was a beautiful summer afternoon at the races, and the smell of burning rubber brought back memories of when my parents used to take me to the Comac Motor Speedway when I was a kid. I was strolling about the grounds, handing out flyers, and was pleasantly surprised at the recognition I was receiving when all of a sudden I saw it. A beautiful, thin waist with a shirt that revealed just an inch or two of skin. I couldn't even see her face, but nonetheless, I felt like I had to meet her. I thought over my options. I could simply walk up and introduce myself, but that would take a certain amount of guts, and I knew that that was out of the question. Instead, I saw a husband and wife team of truck drivers who had said hello earlier, and I asked them if they knew who she was. "No," one replied, "but would you like me to find out?" A minute later, they came back with good news. "Her name is Colette, and she said she'd be happy to meet you." Now I had a little more confidence, and I walked over and said, "Hello." "Hello, I'm Colette Christie. How did you get the name Captain Jack?" Uh-oh. An incorrect name right off the bat. For a moment, I had flashbacks to Cortland State, but then realized this was actually a good thing. She didn't know who the hell I was, so there was no way that she could be digging me for my very small amount of fame. Then again, I wasn't so sure she was digging me anyway. "Actually, it's Cactus Jack," I corrected her. I talked with the beautiful chick for about 10 minutes before being summoned to the track. "Can I have your phone number?" I asked with about zero confidence in my voice. "I don't like to give out my number," she replied, "especially because I'm at my aunt and uncle's house. You can give me yours if you like." I wrote down the number and headed off to the racetrack, doubting that I would ever see her again. 3 nights later, I heard the phone ring and picked it up to hear a voice saying, "Hello, is Jack there?" "Which Jack are you looking for?" I inquired, as after all, my dad was the only real Jack in the house. "Cactus Jack," the female voice answered. "This is Cactus." "Hi, I'm Colette Christie," she said. "The girl you met at the racetrack." Moments later, I was securing my first date in a very long time. As it turned out, we had a great time that Thursday night. She came to the matches to see me on Friday, went to the movie to see Ghost on Saturday, took a day off from Foley on Sunday, and moved across the street from me into the room my neighbors were renting out on Monday. The Foley charm had simply been too much to resist. For the rest of the summer, we were inseparable, except for my wrestling shows, during which time she and my mom hung out anyway. We spent a lot of time at the beach, went on road trips, and in a situation that was a little bit awkward, made so many strange noises upstairs directly over Joe and Martha Forte's bedroom that my neighbors of 24 years never looked at little Mickey quite the same way again, if you know what I mean. I had some tremendous matches as an independent, but will probably best be remembered during this time for the series of matches I had with Eddie Gilbert for Joel Goodhart's Tri-State Wrestling in Philadelphia. His quarterly extravaganzas in the Philadelphia Civic Center were the biggest independent shows in the country. It was in these shows that my matches with Eddie took place. After seeing Eddie and me in action in late 1990, Joel booked us a few months later in a Falls Count Anywhere match. I considered that match to be the best of my career for 2 years, right until my match at Beach Blast in June 1992 took over the honors. On the heels of that, Goodhart asked me if I would be interested in doing a barbed wire match with Eddie. The barbed wire match was actually ruled a no contest when I became so badly wrapped up in the wire that I couldn't get out. Normally, a no contest ruling would be a reason to riot in Philly, but because of the serious nature of the predicament I was in, the fans were respectful. Actually, they were pretty concerned. Even when Colette came out to check on me, I didn't hear a single cat call, even though compassion was usually a dirty word to Goodhart's fans. Goodhart was excited about the match and all the media attention that he was receiving because of it. A few weeks after the barbed wire incident, he told me of his master plan, a 2 out of 3 falls match with Gilbert and me, with each match being a gimmick match. Together we came up with the matches: a Falls Count Anywhere, a stretcher match where the loser is the first one unable to get up, and a steel cage match. To do all of these in one night would certainly be challenging, not to mention exhausting, and I embarked on a rather strenuous training program for the big night. I actually felt like I was in the best shape of my career as I pulled into the Civic Center. What followed were 40 minutes of what Eddie Gilbert actually called the best matches in his life. Coming from Eddie, that was high praise, as he was one of the most talented and hardest working guys in the business before his untimely death 3 years later in Puerto Rico. We tried to resurrect our history after I left WCW in 1994, but could never quite get it done. I regret that. I also regret not wrestling on the first Eddie Gilbert memorial card right before I went to the World Wrestling Federation, because I know it would have meant a lot to his brother Doug and to his mom and dad. The best I can do is remember Eddie for what he was to me: a teacher, a mentor, and a friend. I had wrestled independently for the past 14 months. In that time, I had improved tremendously, gained valuable confidence, learned to work the mic, and had a much better idea of who I was in the ring and what I was trying to accomplish. Unfortunately, my bank account had not expanded at the same rate that my wrestling had, and with Colette 2 months pregnant, I decided to more actively pursue more gainful employment. When WCW came to the Meadowlands Arena in New Jersey, Colette and I decided to go. After all, in this business, as in many others, if you're out of sight, you're out of mind. 2 days later, WCW called with the news that would change my life. They offered me employment, but even more important, the chance to work with their #1 star, Sting. I later learned that this run with Sting, as well as my stint in WCW, were planned to be short-lived. The office, knowing of Sting's slightly shriveling market value, hoped to feed him a string of monster heels in rapid-fire succession. Jim Ross, who apparently had been trying to sell Booker Dusty Rhodes on me for quite a while, was able to volunteer me for this limited role. It was thought that a quick conquering of so many monsters in such a short time would boost Sting's image, enabling him to draw more money with a real wrestler. In retrospect, I guess I'm lucky I didn't know of this plan, because I flew to Sioux City, Iowa, without the pressure of that knowledge. My opponent for that evening would be Larry Santo. This was a triumphant return for me as I dropped the big elbow on Santo on the concrete, performed the flying upside-down Cactus Jack crack smash or front somersault off the ring apron, and offered the WCW debut of the double-arm DDT. At one point, Jim Ross added to the drama with one of his classic calls: "My goodness, Larry Santo has a family, and Cactus Jack doesn't care." My first match with Sting was a great turning point because the two of us clicked instantly. Sting was excited. He'd actually found someone he could look forward to wrestling. Abdullah the Butcher, My opponent from a year earlier was another of the wrestlers brought in to feed Sting. With the success of Cactus Jack, the feeding angle was stopped, and Dusty decided to team me up with Abdullah. Abby was one of the great monsters in the business. In real life, Abby was a sharp businessman and an even sharper dresser who now owns and operates Abdullah the Butcher's House of Ribs in Atlanta. He chewed unlit cigars and spoke with a surprisingly high voice, was a man with such class that he once held a fart in for over 200 miles so as not to offend my wife, who was traveling with me. There was a small bit of irony attached to this team. As a freshman in college, I had taped a picture of Abdullah to my wall, and by the end of the year had everyone in Fitzgerald Hall believing that Abdullah the Butcher was my father. Strange when you consider that Abby was a 400-pound black man with grooves carved into his head so deep that he used to flip out people in casinos by inserting gambling chips into them. Abdullah was always an adventure to team up with. Some guys like to plan lots of moves and then perform them like a dance in the ring. Abdullah was the exact opposite. You didn't plan anything with Abby because, 1, he didn't like it that way, and 2, he wouldn't remember anyway. So for the next several months, for the most part, we wrestled Sting, Steiner, Sting and Steiner, or a 3-man team consisting of Sting, Steiner, and someone else. It was like a theater of the bizarre, and sometimes it worked out well, such as in the Omni in Atlanta, where a tag team match in a cage had the fans rocking in the aisles, and sometimes it didn't. Diamond Dallas Page was another one of my favorite guys to travel with. DDP was a classic. A former nightclub manager and walking cartoon character, he had gotten his start as a manager for Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association. His main attribute at that time was that he was willing to pay his own airfare to television tapings, along with paying for his 2 Diamond girls, and work for free. As a manager, he had been at best average. He had eventually caught on in his home state of Florida as an announcer, where he hooked up with Dusty Rhodes. Dallas was eventually replaced as an announcer. Even as one of his best friends, I've got to admit that his bag of play-by-play cliches was about as well received as a set of fingernails on a chalkboard. So DDP, at the tender age of 35, decided to step into the ring and become a wrestler, where against all odds, he became a top name in the business. It certainly wasn't easy. Most people didn't want to see him succeed. Amid all the negativity, I remember one person predicting big things from him. I was riding in the rental car shuttle bus with Abby when I saw DDP strutting across the parking lot with one of his tacky outfits and some outrageous pair of shades. "He's going to make it, champ," I heard the Butcher say. "Dallas?" I asked with shock in my voice, wondering if years of headshots and cage matches had finally taken their toll on my partner. "Why?" "He lives his gimmick, champ," was Abby's reply. "He lives his gimmick." Indeed he did. He used the same tired cliches in real life that he did on TV. "How are you doing?" a lady would ask as we waited for change at her toll booth. "Lady," DDP would start, "if I was doing any better, I'd have to be twins just to handle it." I tended to roll my eyes a lot when I traveled with Dallas. My favorite DDP story occurred somewhere in the Carolinas in the middle of 1993. I was traveling with DDP and stunning, not quite stone cold yet, Steve Austin, and we were in the second day of a week-long loop. Now, you've got to understand, despite all the cartoonish characteristics, Dallas was a very intense individual. So intense, in fact, that he used to ask us to videotape his match every night. He then studied those damn things for hours, looking to improve in any way he could. Because of his intensity, Dallas was easy to rile up on a road trip. On the first day of this particular trip, Steve and I had made a little bet. "How quick do you think we can crack DDP?" I asked, looking forward to this somewhat cruel pleasure. 3 days, replied Austin, looking forward to the challenge. 3 was good, but I had just a little bit more faith. "We can crack him in 2 days, I stated solemnly, giving Austin my best Jack Lord, book him Dano look. The race was on. The first day started with a quality shot. Austin fired it. "My wife wanted me to pick up a couple of antiques on this trip," Steve innocently said. "What did you tell her?" Dallas responded. "I told her I'd already picked up DDP at the airport," Austin said, laughing. Man, an age joke, an especially sensitive subject for the man who claimed he'd never had a bad day in his life. The verbal blow was a good one, but the aging Dallas shrugged it off. By day 2, however, he wasn't shrugging anything off. He was downright cranky. We checked into a hotel after the evening show, and a still sweaty Dallas was looking forward to a hot shower. He stormed out of the bathroom angered that no towels had been left for us. He called immediately and demanded that housekeeping bring him some on the double. The towels arrived while DDP was down the hall getting ice for his many nagging injuries. The guy strapped so many ice packs to his body that I often suggested he just buy a huge cooler and just lie in it. Steve and I looked at each other. DDP was on the verge of cracking. We couldn't let up now. Thinking quickly, Austin hid all the towels except 2 under a bed. When Dallas inquired about the status of the towels, I informed him that the towels had indeed come and that housekeeping had left them in the bathroom. No sooner had Dallas walked into the john than he came storming out. "This is what they brought us," he screamed, holding aloft one hand towel and a washcloth for Steve and me to see. "God damn it, I'm going to get them myself." The moment Dallas walked out, Steve reached under the bed and pulled out about 8 plush bath towels that he placed directly on the TV so that it would be the first thing DDP saw upon his re-entry to the room. "What a maroon," I said in my best Bugs Bunny impression. "He's just about done." Dallas finally did take his shower, and he emerged from the bathroom in typical fashion, buck naked except for an ice pack on his shoulder and saran wrap around his knees that he claimed kept the joints loose. He then began his pre-sleep ritual that included thumbtacking the blinds to the wall so as not to allow even the faintest ray of sunshine into the room in the morning. I found the whole nude thing a little uncomfortable, to tell you the truth. Poor Dallas turned the lights off and settled into his bed for a long, comfortable nap. Little did he know that his evening wasn't quite over. Earlier, a fan had given us a whole batch of chocolate chip cookies that she had baked. While Dallas showered, Steve and I had dumped approximately 36 soft, chewy beauties between the sheets of DDP's bed, and now as he lay there, I could tell that those delicious toll houses were starting to take effect. It started with a little wriggle, and then grew to the point where he knew something was wrong. What's this?" Dallas said to no one in particular. Steve and I remained silent. Suddenly, it hit him. "There's effing cookies in my bed," he yelled. "Someone put effing cookies in my bed." Silence. Dallas was now screaming at the top of his lungs. "I want to know who put effing cookies in my bed right now." I soon gave myself away. I was laughing so hard under my covers that I couldn't help myself. By holding in this laugh, my stomach was rising up and down rapidly, and Dallas detected the quick in and out breathing from my nostrils. "You!" he yelled and jumped from his bed, turning on the light and throwing back the covers to reveal a plethora of crumbs, chunks, and chips that a helpful fan had hoped would be eaten by 3 of her favorite sports entertainers. Instead, in an ironic twist, her baking bid had backfired. Instead of being eaten, these innocent cookies had eaten up the livid DDP, who was now hell-bent on vengeance. Dallas lunged for me and threw back my sheets. Unlike the naked DDP, I was attired in Fruit of the Looms. He then gathered as many of the broken pieces as he could carry and threw them on top of me. It wasn't enough. He wanted to make sure the cookies would torture me and ruin my sleep the way that I had ruined his. He sat on me and began jumping, trying to grind the offending cookies into my body as I listened to the strange symphony of bouncing bed springs and crackling saran wrap. "There," he yelled. "How do you like it? How do you like effing cookies in your bed?" He waited for my reply. "Well," I started, "it's not the cookies that I mind. It's the fact that you're rubbing your naked ass all over me." DDP got up slowly. He was a defeated man. He went back to his bed and swept away the remaining cookie parts. He turned off the light and lay back down. After about a minute, he spoke, quietly, sadly. "Guys," he began, I think I'm going to get my own room tomorrow." On February 20th, 1992, I became a father. Dewey Francis Foley was born in Massapequa, New York, and after a month of readjusting from his trip through the womb, we packed up our car and 2 dogs and headed for Atlanta and the house on Lake Lanier that I had just rented. It was at about this time that the legendary Bill Watts was brought in as the president of WCW. The Cowboy was either loved or hated depending on whom you talked to. Watts didn't portray his show as sports entertainment or his performers as entertainers. He ran a wrestling show, damn it, and his guys were wrestlers. If you respected the business like I did, it was easy to see why people loved him. It was just as easy to see why people hated him. They thought he was a bully and a tyrant and a dinosaur and a cheapskate. In general, I liked the Cowboy, but some of his ideas seemed a little pointless and dated. In a meeting one day at Center Stage, he let us have it. Within 1 hour, Bill completely changed not only our professional lives, but our personal lives as well. Let's call these Bill's commandments. Thou shalt not jump off the top rope. Thou shalt not play cards in the dressing room. Thou shalt not land on protective mats outside the ring. Thou shalt not bring young children into the locker room. Thou shalt not bring wives to the television tapings. Thou shalt not use sleeper holds. Thou shalt not travel with baby faces. Thou shalt not talk to each other outside the arena. Thou shalt not stay in the same hotel together. Thou shalt not train in the same gym together. And the biggest commandment of them all, thou shalt not leave the building until the final bell of the final match. The last one was the one that angered the boys the most. Nikita Koloff questioned this commandment at a meeting a short time later. Bill addressed the boys and then asked if there were any questions. Koloff raised his hand and when called on, made a plea for sanity. Yeah, Bill, I know that it's important for the guys to stay until the end, but sometimes when we've been away from our families for a few weeks, we might have a chance to catch a night flight home. Do you think in those situations, we might be able to get out a little earlier? Bill thought about it for a second and a half, and then with all the warmth and sensitivity of an IRS auditor, shot forth, yeah, it's a tough business on families. Any more questions? Okay, let's go. Meanwhile, my feud with Sting culminated in a Falls Count Anywhere match at the June 1992 Beach Blast. The match took place at the Mobile Civic Center, not what most would call a tropical paradise, and in truth, we were several miles from the water. I had trained hard for this match. I had immersed myself in mental visualization for the match. I had seen it in my head 1,000 times. The match turned out even better than I'd hoped. The Stinger was up for it, as it had been a while since we'd wrestled against each other. The timing was on, the pacing was great, and some of the transitions were breathtaking. Even Ross and the new color man, Jesse the Body Ventura, were on top of their game. I lost the match but didn't give a damn. As George Costanza might have said, "Baby, I'm back." Even Watts was happy. Gentlemen, he told us, it just doesn't get any better than that. For years, I considered that to be the greatest match of my career. Sting was genuinely flattered to hear me say that, and he'd occasionally ask me after other big matches, "Was mine still your favorite?" I think he was actually saddened when he heard that another one replaced it. It was almost as if he were the queen in Snow White and the magic mirror broke the bad news. I couldn't stop thinking about that match all the way on the 400-mile drive home. I had the top down on my '84 Chrysler and life was good. My health was good. I'd just torn the roof off the Mobile Civic Center. I had a beautiful wife and son, and I was making 6 effing figures a year. A month later, we bought our first house, a beautiful little Victorian with a wraparound porch in Ackworth, Georgia. Ding dong, the witch is dead, came the voice over the telephone. It was my old friend DDP, and it was his way of saying that Bill Watts had been let go. That's great, I said, not really meaning it, but not wanting to be ostracized as a Bill Watts supporter. But who's taking his place? Try to guess, said DDP. I tried a half-dozen times but failed. Finally, he gave the word that in all fairness to the guy would change the face of wrestling quite a bit. Bish. I was stunned. Bish was Eric Bischoff, who had been until that time an announcer, and not a very good one. What I didn't know was that Bish had been impressing the TBS brass with his reasonable ideas and his smooth personality. In a sense, he had been impressing them by being everything that Cowboy Bill Watts was not. I actually thought for a while that the whole Bischoff hiring was going to work out well for me. As an announcer, Eric had not exactly been the most respected guy among the wrestlers, and I was one of the few guys who hadn't treated him like a peon. I actually considered the guy a friend, and hey, there are worse things in the world than having a friend for your boss. Unfortunately, something happened that I hadn't counted on. Once in power, Eric made new friends, and dirty, unkempt Cactus Jack wasn't on the new list. Actually, I can't say Bischoff was ever bad to me. Maybe I wasn't completely off the list, but I had been pushed down it. About this time, I proposed an idea to Dusty Rhodes, one that culminated in a devastating injury at the hands of Vader, who was at the time the most feared man in wrestling. Dusty thought about it for a few minutes, and then he got a look on his face as if he just had a major revelation. He started to speak Dusty style in his excited, animated fashion. "That's it, baby, and when Vader hurts you, you'll have amnesia. You'll go home, but you won't even know your family." He continued to speak, but all I could think was how outlandish the whole thing was, and that it would never work. Nobody was going to believe amnesia. This was WCW, not Days of Our Lives. I was just about to speak up when Dusty said the magic words, "We'll take you off the road for 4 months and we'll pay you." When he asked me what I thought, I gushed, "I love it, Dream. I really love it." Vader and I had 2 matches to set up the injury. I thought the psychology of the first match was pretty simple. I'd get the living crap beaten out of me, but somehow pull out a victory. I began talking to Vader about swelling my eye up a little bit, and he seemed to brush it off by offering me another idea. "Maybe I can get a little blood from your nose, too." "Okay," I said. Legendary wrestler Harley Race, who was now Vader's manager, was there and helpfully offered to bust my eyebrow open. Busting an eyebrow is the little-known and little-exercised act of creating a gash over the eyebrow by punching downward with the point of the knuckles. When done correctly, it is as effective at creating realism as anything in the business. When done incorrectly, by stressing force over technique, it does nothing but raise welts. There were only a few people whom I trusted to bust me open, and Harley was one of them. Oddly, even though I have the reputation for being the hardcore legend, I was surprisingly inept when it came to eyebrow busting. One night in ECW in 1997, I tried to open up Tommy Dreamer, and I was failing miserably. After I bounced punches off his nose, cheek, and forehead, he looked up at me and asked painfully, "Please stop hitting me." The bell rang and Vader started in. He pushed me into the turnbuckle, pushed my head back, and brought down 4 forearms right in a row, right across the bridge of my nose. Bam, 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 bam. You could actually hear the sick sound of his wrist bone breaking my nose. Vader looked for blood, and when he didn't see it, he became a man obsessed. He forgot all about the eye swelling and continually went after my nose. I wanted to tell the dumb bastard that I'd reconsidered and that maybe he ought to think about stomping his foot on the mat instead. Finally, about a thimbleful of blood dribbled out, and he remembered our talk about the eye. Boom, boom, 2 punches to the cheek and eyebrow, and I went down. I have an unedited version of the tape. WCW refused to show some of it, and those 2 punches were awesome. I rolled out to the floor where Harley was waiting anxiously for his big punch. He took one look at me, however, and saw that blood was already streaming from both my eyebrow and cheek, in addition to the little dribble from my broken nose. "Damn it, it's already done," grumbled a disappointed Harley as he rolled me back into the ring. The fans were completely caught up in the contest, as I think most of them could tell that something a little different was going on. Vader went for a splash against the rail and caught nothing but steel as I moved out of harm's way. One Cactus Jack upside down crack smash later, and I rolled back into the ring, the winner of a count-out victory. The fans reacted as if I'd just won the Super Bowl. It was a rare moment of real emotion in a promotion that was almost void of it. Believe it or not, the locker room was like a huge celebration afterward. The other wrestlers were blown away by what they'd just seen. Even Ole Anderson came by and admitted that it had been a hell of a match. Lex Luger jokingly checked Ole's trousers to see if he'd been aroused by the beating, as Ole was known to enjoy misery and human suffering. Vader and I hugged, and even Harley tried his best to put on a happy face, despite the bitter letdown he'd just endured. The return match was a scary, eerie night that I'll long remember. Before leaving home, I wrote a note for Colette. It was essentially a last will and testament instructing her on what to do in case things didn't turn out too well. Thank God she never had to read it. I hope you don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that the ramifications of this match were tremendous and the risk of serious injury was extremely high. As the willing participant of a powerbomb on the concrete floor, I was putting myself in a precarious predicament. I was essentially letting the most dangerous man in the business perform the sport's most dangerous move on a concrete floor. I had seen Vader temporarily paralyze young wrestler Joe Thurman with the move inside the ring that had some give to it. I had seen that powerbomb literally knock out others, and I had seen some kids quit the company rather than risk the consequences of the powerbomb. The biomechanics of the powerbomb are simple. You flip your bent-over opponent in the air as high as possible and bring his back, neck, and head down to the canvas with as much force as possible. It can be scary to watch. The match itself was a solid piece of business. Many considered it to be better than the first, although obviously I couldn't absorb the same shots to the face again. As the match drew to a conclusion, I attempted another Cactus Jack upside-down crack smash, the same move that had led me to victory a week before. This time, Harley jerked Vader out of the way and I landed hard on the blue protective mat. As announcer Tony Schiavone and Jesse Ventura called the action, Vader threw back the blue mats, revealing the cold concrete floor below. I was crossing myself as Vader picked me up off the floor. As he put my head between his massive thighs, I was thinking out loud, "I love you, Colette. I love you, my tiny man." Vader crouched down with all his might, lifting me into the air. "My God, if he does that, he'll kill him," yelled Schiavone. A moment later, I hit the concrete. My initial reaction was strange. That didn't feel too bad, but I bet it didn't look too good on TV. Then my right foot and hand went numb. After 40 minutes, the ambulance arrived and I was put on a stretcher. Several people in the audience were crying. I was placed in the ambulance, and of all people, Jesse Ventura came along for the ride. As the ambulance pulled away with sirens wailing, the show faded to black. It was great drama. Was it staged? Yes, but in many ways it was real nonetheless. The doctor informed me that I had suffered a severe blow to the back of my head, which had likely caused my brain to more or less short circuit, causing the temporary loss of sensation in my extremities. I was given a list of things to do and not to do, and was released at about 1 a.m. Janie Engel, a WCW front office employee, drove me home. I was groggy, but all things considered, I felt pretty fortunate. When I got home, Colette met me at the door and gave me a long embrace. I went upstairs and kissed my sleeping little buddy, then went into our bedroom where, against doctor's orders, I fell asleep myself. I awoke to the ringing of the phone. "I just called to check on you," said a weathered, slightly inebriated voice on the phone. It was handsome Harley. "Do you think it went okay?" I asked. Harley paused and softly said, "Cactus, it couldn't have gone any better if we'd done it 100 times. He spoke one more time before he hung up. "You're the new Harley Race kid." That was the greatest compliment I have ever received. I convalesced at home while a pair of writers prepared an elaborate storyline that would air throughout my 12-week absence. After reading the script, I felt as if they had reached out with a steel-toed boot and kicked me, as DiNucci might say, right in the ball. I saw my career and pay raise fading away before my eyes. In this script, I was to portray Cactus Jack as an escaped mental patient who, believing himself to be a veteran sailor, leads a group of homeless people to a better sense of purpose and self-respect. Wow. After the filming of the first vignette, which I was not involved in, I called director Neil Pruitt, who was a friend of mine, and asked him how it went. Now, usually a director or artist of any kind is the first person to stand behind his work. I was expecting Neil to say, "Oh man, it's great," or "Wait till you see this, you'll love it." Instead, his stammered answer was slow in coming. "Well," Neil said, "it's got a little more humor in it than I would like." "Can you show it to me?" I asked, with a knot tightening in my stomach. "I'll be right over," said Pruitt. I slipped the tape in the VCR and within 2 minutes saw all my aspirations crumble before me like the cookies in Diamond Dallas's bed. I could feel my figurative ball swelling to grapefruit-sized proportions from the blow of the steel-toed boot entitled "Lost in Cleveland." In the vignette, a tabloid-like female television reporter seeks clues to find the missing Cactus Jack at the mental hospital he has escaped from. A helpful patient with a blanket folded over his lap, eating cheese doodles with a toothpick, and eerily reminiscent of Dustin Hoffman's idiot savant in Rain Man, says, "Jack, over there, yeah, Jack's definitely over there." Running over to a man shooting baskets at a tiny basketball hoop, the reporter yells, "Jack, is that you, Jack?" Causing a man to turn around and say in a terrible Nicholson impression, "Hey, I'm not making this stuff up. How's it going, nursey baby?" Upset at this cruel hand that fate had dealt her, the reporter whines that she'll never find Jack. "Jack?" asked the Hoffman character. "Cleveland, yeah. Jack's in Cleveland. Definitely Cleveland." If you do have a copy of these rare sketches, resist the urge to watch them, even if the idea of a clean-shaven, eyebrowless Cactus Jack talking about mizzen-masts and nor'easters does turn you on. Instead, please, if you have any respect for me at all, burn them now to preserve the sanctity of my reputation for further generations to enjoy. I returned against Vader at Halloween Havoc in 1993, which was an artistic and athletic victory. Some people feel that it was the best match Vader and I ever had, and some feel it was the most brutal. I don't know about that, but it was definitely a physical affair that left me battered and bleeding from a busted eyebrow. No, Harley still didn't get to do it. The next time I go to Harley's for a barbecue, I'm going to let the poor SOB bust me open just so I won't have it on my conscience. Shortly after that match, I was asked by a fan on a call-in radio show what the highest moment of my career was. I replied that it was during Halloween Havoc, right after I had drilled Vader with a foreign object at ringside. I looked up at the crowd and did a slow half turn, covering about a third of the arena with my eyes. Everywhere I looked, people stood in unison, almost like fans doing the wave, except they weren't performing a rah-rah choreographer move. They were transfixed by the intensity of the match. It truly was a powerful moment. The same fan then asked what my lowest point was. My answer was simple. About 10 minutes later, when I knew I'd never be that high again. Thankfully, I was wrong. The Foley family welcomed Noelle Margaret into the world on December 15th, 1993. 2 days after Noelle's birth, the wrestlers all gathered at CNN Center for our first ever meeting with Ted Turner. Now, I respect Ted for his vision and his philanthropy, and he helped make a very good movie about the Battle of Gettysburg. When it came to his wrestling product, Ted was a little out of touch. It seemed as if the only wrestler in the room that Ted knew was Ric Flair. "I know Rick wrestled there. Rick, how do you feel about that?" Rick. Eric Bischoff may not have been a great announcer, and his later on-air heel persona may have at times made me want to throw a brick through my TV, but hey, he was no fool. He knew where his bread was buttered, and Ric Flair became the new booker about 11 seconds after the meeting adjourned. In March, we headed for Germany in a match with Vader that cost me 2/3 of my right ear. My head became hopelessly caught up in the ring ropes, and I thought I was going to die. In a move that an announcer likened to a fox chewing its paw to escape a trap, I pulled my head out, and my ear chose not to come with me. I tried to take the ear with me, and even though I speak pretty decent German, I could not come up with the German word for formaldehyde, and so as I watched helplessly a German Krankenschwester or nurse stepped on the stainless steel pedal of the medical garbage can, and deep-sixed my remaining ear forevermore. She then turned to me and said, "Ist der Catch alles Schauspiel," which means, "Isn't wrestling all fake?" I was flown home and showed up at Center Stage Theater the next week raring to go, wondering what the brain power in WCW had come up with to take advantage of this unexpected gift. To me, this would be a booker's dream. Forget the bogus knee injury angles. This was a certifiable gold mine. I mean, how could anyone not see the money in a Cactus versus Vader, "You tore off my ear, you son of a bitch" grudge match? The match would sell itself. It would be so easy. It would be... Oops. I forgot we were talking about WCW here, a group of people who could screw up a wet dream. They did nothing. With depression setting in and with the knowledge that I had no future in WCW, I scheduled, with Bischoff's approval, an operation that would reconstruct a new ear out of one of my ribs and the cartilage behind my ear. Eric assured me that as the accident had occurred inside the ring, I would be fully compensated during my 6-month absence. 2 days before the surgery, I received a phone call from WCW asking me to come back to work with the promise that "we're going to go all the way with you." Like an idiot, I returned. 2 months later, I was booked in a Texas death match with Vader. In Texas death match rules, pinfalls count, but they don't end the match. The wrestler has 10 seconds to answer the bell. The match continues until one man can't answer the bell. Vader and I picked up right where we had left off. I had Vader rocking and reeling with punches that were thrown damn near as hard as I could. I gave him a chair shot that had him seeing stars. I went for the elbow off the ring apron, but Harley tripped me and I tumbled to the floor. Vader then threw back the blue protective mats, and exactly 1 year later, to the day that my foot and hand had gone numb in Atlanta, powerbombed me on the cold, hard concrete floor. Vader covered me for the easy pin, but the match wasn't over yet. The referee began his count as I lay prone. 1, 2, 3, no movement. 4, 5, I started to move. 6, 7, I was on my knees. 8, 9, Cactus Jack was on his feet. Then with the ref's back turned, Harley hit me from behind and I went down. 10, I lost the match. The loss, as is usually the case in our sport, didn't really matter, because in this case, the real victory was a moral one. I had taken the powerbomb and had gotten up. Nothing could be simpler. I went to the back feeling like the weight of the world was off my shoulders. It's amazing how a good match can make you feel that way. I talked excitedly with Eric Bischoff about the story of the match. I told him about the coincidence of the 2 matches occurring on the same day 1 year apart. He agreed it was great timing and assured me that they would play it up when it aired on TV. Even though Jim Ross was now working for the competition, the WWF, I could hear his voice in my head. "The referee is counting, folks, but it's just a formality. This one is over. What we really need, some medical attention down here. But wait, what's this? Cactus Jack is starting to move. My God, he's on his knees. Ladies and gentlemen, in 25 years, this is the damnedest thing I've ever seen. Cactus Jack is up. Cactus Jack is up." It didn't matter who was calling the match, however. This was too good to miss. Only a complete idiot could screw this thing up. A week later, we traveled to Fort Lauderdale. I tripled up in a room with Steve Austin and Steve Regal. These were 2 of my favorite guys to travel with, and we were looking forward to having a good time. Now, never mind the fact that these 3 big-time wrestlers were so cheap that they actually had 3 guys jammed into a flea-bitten $30 Econo Lodge. The key thing was that the lodge was right across the street from the beach, and having practically grown up in the Atlantic Ocean as a kid, I was going to be hitting the surf as soon as I could throw my trunks on. The 3 of us walked across the street, and I dove in gracefully and headed out to sea, while Austin and Regal soaked up some rays in the beautiful South Florida sun. I floated on my back for a few minutes, several hundred yards from shore, and when I looked to the beach, I saw that both Steves were gone. Then in the distance, I saw them walking back across the street. A minute later, I could see them sitting by the pool. That's strange, I thought. Trading the ocean for the pool? But hey, I wasn't going to let those party poopers ruin my fun. I frolicked some more. After a while, I headed into shore. I got to the sand, reached for my towel, and began to dry off. I looked around to see if any hot chicks had been checking me out, but didn't notice any. There sure are a lot of guys here, though, I thought. I looked some more and saw two guys holding hands. The idea that something was a little odd was starting to sink in. Then I saw two guys kissing, and the whole sinking process started to accelerate, as did the sprinting process. I don't think David Hasselhoff could have kicked up the sand any faster as I hightailed it off the beach, across Highway A1A, and into the pool area of the Fort Lauderdale Econo Lodge. Austin and Regal were laughing hysterically. "You pricks," I yelled, even while laughing myself. "You left me on a gay beach." The next morning, we woke up and fumbled through the television stations on the remote control. "Let's keep it there," I requested when the sterile ambiance of WCW Worldwide flickered onto the screen. My match with Vader was on. Boom, boom, boom. I was really nailing him. I was nervous with anticipation as Vader threw back the mat. They hadn't made reference to the injury of exactly 1 year ago yet, but now the story would surely unfold. Vader picked me up for the powerbomb and sent me crashing down to the concrete. Splat! To tell you the truth, this one actually looked more devastating than the one in '93. I listened for the brilliant call. Sometimes the right words can really cement an image in the fans' minds. Here it comes. Bobby the Brain Heenan was the first to comment on this historic career-turning moment. "That'll give you Excedrin headache number 9, said the Brain, with about as much raw and naked emotion as Al Gore on sedatives. "Indeed it will," added Tony Schiavone. Then, nothing. Or nothing that I had suggested, visualized, hoped for, or at least in a worst-case scenario, would have settled for. No, "My God, he's on his knees." No, "This is the damnedest thing I've ever seen." No, "1 year ago to this very day." No talk about last year's injury. No moral victory. Just Excedrin headache number 9. I had said it would take a total idiot to screw it up, and by golly, they hadn't let me down. This was the final nail. I thought about it for 2 days and made my decision to quit World Championship Wrestling. Leaving a 6-figure job is not an easy decision to make, especially with the uncertainty of the independent wrestling scene. Bischoff was surprised when I told him the news, but he did not seem all that upset about it. Colette was a different story. "What do you mean you're leaving? You've got a 4-month-old daughter, Mickey," Colette yelled, trying to reason with me. "We'll be all right," I assured her. "I can work lots of places, but you can't make this kind of money anywhere else," she continued. "Listen, hon, if I stick around, I will be worthless within a year," I fired back. "At least this way I can buy some time and maybe come back when things are different." My final match was a loser leaves WCW with Kevin Sullivan. It was pretty good. Anyone with an appreciation for spontaneity and give-and-take brawling would have enjoyed it especially. WCW had certain rules pertaining to violence, but we ignored those right off the bat. I mean, what were they going to do? Fire me? I was in the shower, cleansing not only my body, but 3 years of memories, when Bischoff approached me. He thanked me for my effort and told me if I behaved myself, I'd be welcome to come back at a later time. He hugged me, and while the hot water produced its steamy fog around us, we held each other for a long, long time. Come on, you didn't really buy that, did you? Nah, there was no shower, no steam, no hug, and no holding for a long, long time. Actually, he caught up to me as I was walking out the door. He did thank me, did tell me I could come back, and then shook my hand. I then walked out into the cool autumn breeze, a free man. I arrived at the ECW Arena at the end of September. ECW was a small promotion based out of Philadelphia that prided itself on its rabid fans and hardcore wrestling style. Todd Gordon, who had been the financial backer for Joel Goodhart's Tri-State Wrestling, was the owner and was a big fan of mine. Paul E. Dangerously, wrestling's mad scientist, was their booker and had, on a shoestring budget, put together the most exciting wrestling show on television. I was excited about the show because it was to be my first singles match with the Funker, Terry Funk. I had been a friend of Terry's for years, and he was pretty much my hero in the business. He had seen it all and done it all, but he still had the decency to respect all the other wrestlers, and he never failed to be polite to the fans. When the bell rang, however, Terry was a different man. He would become a wild-eyed madman at every show, no matter how small the crowd. He could be that out-of-control madman one moment and kindly old Uncle Terry the next. Even at the age of 50, he took a tremendous beating, and even years later at 54, took a World Wrestling Federation beating from me so bad that I apologized to him for days about it. "Cactus, now don't give me that shit," he'd say in his soft-spoken mumble whisper. "That's part of the business, and I was glad I could do it for you." We had the ECW fans rocking and rolling when a tag team called the Public Enemy hit the ring. Seeing that the PE had pooped on our party, Terry and I banded together to fight them off. After a minute, they went down, and Terry told me to get him a chair. There were no more within easy reach, so I called a fan to throw me his. He willingly obliged, and a chair sailed into the ring. Then another one flew in, then another, and another, and another. It was literally raining chairs as the plastic seating devices were coming from all angles. In all my years, it was the damnedest thing I'd ever seen. I stood there in wonderment at this spectacle until one of the chairs bounced off my head, and I realized it was time to leave. In a scene that would be replayed weekly on ECW television for years, the ring had been bombarded with over 200 chairs, with the Public Enemy literally buried underneath. The backstage area of the converted bingo hall turned into ECW Arena often more closely resembled a triage unit at a hospital. So many guys were trying so hard to impress this unique audience that injuries were inevitable. Guys were practically killing themselves to earn the fans' approval, and the fans in ECW could often be callous about these ring mishaps. In late November, I received word that Terry Funk had signed a contract to wrestle for the International Wrestling Association in Japan. I picked up the phone and called IWA promoter Victor Quinones. It was the only time in my 18 months as an independent that I asked for work. I was booked to leave on New Year's Eve for a 10-day tour. My body would never be quite the same. I flew to Tokyo in style. Seat 38E was far enough away from the movie screen to make viewing difficult, but close enough to both the toilet and the smoking section to ensure a pleasant sensory experience. Northwest Airlines' cold soba noodle breakfast is an especially disagreeable one, and when we landed, I was exhausted, sick to my stomach, and smelled like a 290-pound cigarette. As a small promotion, the IWA had to cut corners to survive. It flew all the wrestlers on coach, bussed us for hours every day, and lodged us in some pretty crummy accommodations. At $300 a day, I was, with the exception exception of
All right. Now we got the first part of Mick Foley, Have a Nice Day audiobook. A Nice Day, which is of a tale of blood and sweat socks. Could you guys believe the stuff that we heard so far with Mick Foley? Now, there will be a second part to this. We're going to be a little over an hour. But other than that, though, what do you guys think of the book so far? Mick Foley, a guy who literally came from nothing, put in the work, put it all on the line, and is now considered a WWE Hall of Famer and a legend. So definitely he deserves all the accolades he has in his career. There's no other way to describe it. Yeah, so
battery low.
He definitely deserves all the work. But other than that, guys, Mick definitely deserves his due. And it's a very interesting book thus far. I can see why everyone patterned their motto after the great Mick Foley. But I will have a second part to this audiobook. Stay tuned for that. Will come very, very soon, sometime this week. Thank you all for coming out. Checking out the book. Soon two videos will pop up. One will be Bloodline versus Bloodline match. The next video will be Liv Morgan, the new women's champion. Until then, it is OUT.